welcome to the Weekly Stuff podcast with Jonathan Lack.
And Sean Chapman.
We are here to talk about stuff. This week on the show, the password is Fidelio, because we have a veritable orgy of stuff to talk about.
How long have you been thinking about that intro, Jonathan?
It came to me literally right as you signed on to Zoom, Sean, and I went, that would be funny. I don't know why. Okay, there was a piece from Eyes Wide Shut that was also played, a classical piece in a show I watched recently, so maybe subliminally it has been on my mind. But anyway, the point is, we've been off for a couple weeks on the Weekly Stuff. We've been doing a lot of Japanimation Station work. And so we've got a lot to catch up on. I've been playing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Sean's been watching a shit ton of anime. I've been watching a shit ton of TV. I got a cool new toy I want to talk about, a video game device. It's going to be a good shoot the shit episode. I think we've got, like I said, veritable orgy of stuff to get through. But it won't be as exciting as that word suggests.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, some of the anime I've watched is very good. So, it depends on what, gets your rocks off, basically.
All right, I think we're off to a terrible start, but that is entirely my fault. Sean, yes. Let me do the housekeeping really quick. Japanimation Stations, Kyoto Vacation, Season 4 of our podcast, that when it's done will be longer than the rest of the series combined, yep. Is in its 5th section, because this season is really like 7 mini-seasons. It's ridiculous. But Part 5, Kyoto Animation Splendid Isolation. We are halfway through. The Beyond the Boundary episode aired just last night when you are listening to this, and that is up. Beyond the Boundary is probably the weakest show we've talked about from KyoAni, but I think it made a really entertaining episode. Even if you haven't seen that show, you should listen to that episode. But we've also reviewed Love, Chunibyo, and Other Delusions, Tomoko Market. Next week, we're coming back with Love, Chunibyo, and Other Delusions Season 2. A lot of good stuff, and when we're done with all of this, we're going to be getting around to Sound Euphonium, which is in the news again because Season 3 just started. So, yes. Lots of good stuff.
Yes, it's very exciting. It's good. It's a good series. I'm having a good time with it.
And I think the timing, because this has taken us so long to get through, Sean, is basically going to work for us to review Sound Euphonium Season 3 in real time just as part of the season, which is making me laugh very hard, because we were assuming we would be coming back after another season to do that, but no, it's just going to be part of this season before we even get to Violet Evergarden and everything, so, yeah.
Let's say, sometimes it works out well, that we are unstoppable, that we will just keep on. I mean, it's already, what is it, like 7 or 8 episodes longer than what we originally designed, because we did the Endless 8 episode, which we didn't plan. Yeah. We're doing this entire part, which we didn't plan. Yes. There's a couple of other episodes that we're not in the original design, that we haven't even gotten to yet. So it was already designed to be the biggest one. I spent a lot of time trying to be like, where can we find some nips and tucks to shorten this down a little bit? And all that effort was for naught, because we have ballooned it out to almost what it would have been if I hadn't chosen to cut things out anyways.
It's nuts, but I'm having fun. When it is done, we will be reviewing other anime. We promise. Yes. There's lots more to come out. Just found out Mobile Suit Gundam Seed Freedom is coming out here in the States in May for a theatrical screening, so we'll be doing that in May, obviously. Mm-hmm. But anyway, lots of fun stuff to talk about there. Over on the Weekly Stuff Wordcast, Japanimation State, JonathanLack.com. I'm getting everything mixed up because we are doing so much stuff. But there's so much stuff over there, too. This is a free Substack, and I have not seen a free Substack that gives you more content than I do. To be honest, I don't read a lot of other Substacks. But the ones I do, they paywall way more than I do, because I paywall nothing. And you get, right now we're in the middle of Miyazaki Madness, where I'm publishing all my Hayao Miyazaki reviews. We just did Kiki's Delivery Service. We're at Yu-Gi-Oh! Kill Count Part 10, where in 2 volumes, 165 people are murdered. That's fun. Why aren't you reading that? I reviewed Alex Garland's Civil War, which is the best film of 2024 so far. It's fucking outstanding. Yeah, I loved that movie. That's on there. You can read that review. There's lots and lots of good stuff over there. So if you have not subscribed, JonathanLack.com. But I think that takes care of the housekeeping and the shilling. I say shilling. We're not making money off of any of this. So Please, go read, support. But yes, Sean, what have you been up to that we want to talk about? I guess one thing we should probably decide on. We had talked last time we recorded about starting to play Final Fantasy VII Rebirth together. Have you played any of that yet?
Yes, I am through the tutorial, basically. Like, the beginning of that game is very long. Like, I I just got to the part where you learn it's a Ubisoft open world game because there's a tower and you unlock a tower and it puts icons on your map. And then I did a bunch of VR missions for a little boy. And yeah, so that's where I'm at. So yeah, I'm very just near the beginning, but I have played some, yes.
Why don't we save that for later then? Because I've played a shit ton more, and we can just talk about that together a little bit. So let's save that for later. But what other stuff would you like to talk about on this episode?
Let's start with anime. Let's talk about some anime in our podcast. That's not the anime podcast, but we're going to talk about anime in it anyways. I've watched a lot of anime over the past couple weeks because the most stacked anime season in recent memory has ended. I'm still not done getting through all the major shows. Like, I haven't started Apothecary Diaries, which is like the other really popular one. But there's a few things I've watched I want to talk about. First of all, Frieren. Holy shit. Frieren is an amazing show. Frieren Beyond Journey's End, or So-So no Frieren if you're looking at the Japanese title. This obviously is the show that I think was like the big breakout hit. Hugely popular in Japan, hugely popular over here, got like shared online, turned into a million memes, all that kind of stuff. And it very much is well-deserved. It's one of the best anime in recent memory. Like, I think the last time I watched a show I was this impressed by would have been either Bocchi the Rock or season 3 of Kaguya-sama. In terms of like a modern anime, I mean, it is incredibly good. It's directed by Keiichiro Saito, who is the director for Bocchi the Rock. So there is a clear kind of lineage there. And Bocchi the Rock was his first show he directed. So it's pretty wild. This kind of 1-2 punch that's done by Madhouse as a studio, that's obviously has an incredibly good reputation, has done many incredible classic shows for several decades at this point. And yeah, this show is just really cream of the crop. It's a fantasy show that is kind of like a fantasy slice of life. It's a really interesting mixing of genres because it also has just like a little bit of shonen jumpy battle stuff in it. Not a lot, but just a bit. And it gets a little bit heavier once you get near the end of the season, where there's what you could almost describe as like a tournament arc. It's not quite a tournament arc, but it's close. Like, it reminds me a little bit of like the Chunin exams in Naruto if you just took a little slice of it and did a kind of mini arc around that. But it's basically about this character Frieren, who is an elf who's been around for like 1,000+ years. And the big kind of hook of the show is that the first episode starts after her and the heroes that basically are like the main characters in a Dragon Quest game kind of thing have finished their big quest. They defeated the Demon King and they've returned to the starting city to go to the, king to say like, hey, we did it. We won, like in a Dragon Quest game, in your classic Japanese, fantasy style story. And that's where it starts. And then she leaves Frieren to go basically on like a little journey to collect some magic, which ends up taking like 50 years because her understanding of time is very different than humans. When she comes back, she realizes that she's basically missed out on the entire life of Himmel, who is the main hero who defeated the Demon King, because he's now an old man. And shortly after she returns to the capital and meets him again, he passes away just from like natural causes. And this causes her to go on this sort of journey of self-reflection, of thinking about like what are like people to her, what is her relationship with humans like, what is her relationship with time like, and this feeling of like regret she is now struggling with over having missed this whole kind of lifetime of this person that she realizes she really cared about. And in that journey, she meets another character, Frieren, who she meets as a little girl that she takes in as her magic apprentice. And Frieren goes on with her on this journey where they're basically tracking back through the same path she took 80 years ago when she went with the heroes party to the Demon King castle. And then they meet various people along the way. Some of them join them on their journey, some of them don't. And it's very much this sort of like pseudo slice of life thing where it's about the journey, like very literally. It's about like taking like each step on this path and what do you learn about yourself, and then also reflecting on your history. Because the title in Japanese, So-So no Frieren, the so-so, that's a word that in Japanese basically means like attending a funeral procession or something like that. And so that's kind of like the theme of the show. where it's interspersed with the stuff going on in the present day, and then Frieren having flashbacks to her time with the party in their original journey and sort of exploring those feelings. And it's really good. It's got such a rich kind of emotional depth to it. It's also outrageously funny because all the characters are so well done. Like, that's, I think, the real magic of the series, is that the characters feel remarkably lived in and real, and so three-dimensional and fleshed out. Even characters that are only in it for an episode or two just really stand out so much in your memory. And especially Frieren herself, who is, I think, like, kind of an immediately iconic feeling character, both in her design, her writing, and her performance. She just is so funny, so interesting, has so much richness to her as you slowly kind of peel back the layers of her history, what makes her tick, her relationship to Himmel and the Old Heroes Party, as well as her history with the larger world, obviously because she's been alive for so long, and the kind of eternal battle with, like, the demon races that goes on in this world, and her kind of participation in that. It's really fascinating. One other thing about it is that while it is not an action show, when it does do the action stuff, it's incredibly good. Like, the violence in this show is really well depicted. That is, like, very, like, sudden and intense and impactful. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so interesting a show, is that because it's not quite a slice of life comedy, it's not quite a sort of normal fantasy show, it's not quite an action show, it's pulling bits and pieces from all these different genres to make this really interesting blend. All the different pieces of those other genres become more interesting through that juxtaposition. So when it does action, it stands out so much because it's really rare. And then when it does comedy, it's when it does something that's like a more straight comedy bit, it can be outrageously funny. Because it's not always just being a straight comedy. It's just such a mix of all these different vibes, and that's phenomenal. And then one other thing I really want to make sure I shout out is, with Frieren, is the lead performance there, which is by Tanizaki Atsumi, who is now, like, just like the kind of the hottest new actress in the anime scene in Japan, because her other most recent role that people would know her for is Anya in Spy Family. And you could not pick two more different characters than Frieren and Anya. Like, you'd never be able to tell it's the same actress. And it's a really amazing performance in this show, because Frieren has so many sides to her that she has to portray. And it's like, that's a incredible, sort of follow up to her Anya role, is then going and doing Frieren. It's pretty fucking wild. There's all the other voice actors are also good. Also, want to sound out Ichino Sakana, who she was Sleta in Witch from Mercury, and she plays Fern. So she's basically the co-lead in this show. That is also an amazing performance. So, Frieren Beyond Journey's End.
I am super excited to watch this show.
Yeah.
I haven't watched it yet. It's high on my to-do list. And honestly, part of the reason I haven't watched it is I am in a weird position with my dissertation where I am very close to being done with the initial draft of the entire thing. And you know what I'm about to say.
Yes.
I am worried because, okay, I know Frieren is not an isekai show. It is isekai adjacent in so much as it deals with, like, the Dragon Quest-y tropes, right?
Yes.
And I'm worried. I wrote a whole chapter about that. Am I going to watch this show and feel like I have to work this fucking show into this somewhere? And I don't want to do that. I want to be done. I have set... For my own sanity, Sean, I have set myself an internal deadline of what is the cutoff after which anime that are released are not eligible to be included in my dissertation, and it is May 12th. And you know why it's May 12th? Because that's the day the next Demon Slayer season premieres, and there's already enough Demon Slayer in my dissertation. I don't want to have to, watch whatever crazy shit Ufotable gets up to and then be like, I go rewrite that section. So I've told myself no more, but I'm worried Frieren will somehow worm its way in, and, I got to stop myself somewhere.
Yes. I mean, it would be a good show to include, because, the other thing I guess I didn't mention is just the production quality is absolutely phenomenal. The animation, top to bottom, is just, I think I mentioned this because the last podcast we did, I had watched, the first couple of episodes, but it is the show, along with one other show I'll talk about in a little bit, that it feels like, oh, this is not sort of feel lesser in comparison to what we've been watching purely from a production point of view with the KyoAni stuff. Because even Beyond the Boundary, which in terms of the story and the characters is maybe a bit of a miss, The production is incredible and it looks amazing, and the direction is phenomenal. Like the storyboarding, the animation, all that stuff is incredible in Beyond the Boundary. And Frieren like absolutely holds its own. It's as good as any other production in a modern anime. I mean, it's particularly the sense of weight to the animation, because they really want you to feel like these are real people. And so it does have a sort of KyoAni-esque quality to it, because again, while there is action is not the main focus of the show. And so much of the sort of splendor of the animation is in little things, in little movements, in the movement of hair, the shifting of the body's weight to express a feeling. Like, that's so much of what makes Frieren amazing from a production point of view. So if you did watch it in time to put it in your dissertation, Jonathan, you would probably feel incredibly obliged to try to put it in there, because I think there is some stuff about it that would stand out to you in that way. So that's up to you how you want to tackle that information.
I will do it, I will watch it. I'm very excited to watch it, but it's especially as I near the end, it is the like biggest stressor on my mind, is like I can't at a certain point it has to stop and this is, I think every writer has this, especially if you are like me trying to be current. I'm trying not to just write about stuff that's like 10 years old, and so it's a challenge, but it's a good challenge, and I'm excited to see that show. Madhouse, it's amazing when I go look up the list of shows Madhouse has done, and I'm like, oh, they did all of those. It's always so fucking crazy, because it's the most diverse set of crazy shit, movies and TV, and yeah, I love them.
Yes, yeah. So Frieren, Beyond Journey's End, obviously it doesn't even really need my sort of like recommendation, because it so automatically comes with that recommendation. But if people have not watched it,
here's one question. I know the manga is ongoing. Does it feel like the show is over, or that when there's enough manga, they'll be doing more?
No, I bet they'll do more. Like, it does not hit I feel like it hits a point that feels fairly satisfying, because it is long. It's a 28 episode season, because they did like this 4 episode premiere where they did the first 4 episodes in one go. So it does feel like you get like a really meaningful amount of story, but it also does not hit a point where it feels like, oh, if they, like, I feel like I would be disappointed if they didn't do more. Because it does not, it sets a goal at the very beginning of here's the place we're trying to get to, and they don't get to that place. Because they haven't gotten to that place from what I understand in the manga either. So, and I don't know if the manga is actually going to end when they hit the destination in their journey, or if that's just one part. I have no idea how long the mangaka is sort of planning on having it go. But that does make it feel like it does feel incomplete, but not in a way that feels awful. Like, it's not like Oshinoko when I watched that, where that just felt like, oh, this is a very thin slice of a much bigger story, and it did not feel satisfying. I felt satisfied with Frieren, but I still really want more, because there's so clearly a lot more story to be told.
Speaking of shows that are one slice of a story that on its own isn't super satisfying, should we talk about Solo Leveling?
Yes, because that is very much the situation with Solo Leveling. A good show, but one that, it just sort of stops when they're like, oh, we did 12 episodes, we'll take a break, and then they're doing a second season.
Yeah, it's not the end of the world. It's not a fatal flaw. There will be more, but it's the exact problem I had with Chainsaw Man a couple years ago, which was very hyped. I had not read the manga. I'm sure it's very good. But I watched the show. It's no doubt a good show, but it is like, it's just getting going, and then it ends, and you're like, oh, this is way too complex a premise to have done in 12 episodes. This needed to be a 2-course season. I kind of compared to, like, imagine if Jujutsu Kaisen Season 1 had only been the first 13 episodes, how fucking bizarre that would have been. Like, oh, we finished the season, and the main character has been dead for most of it. If you had not had the second half of that season, I don't know if Jujutsu Kaisen as an anime would have landed if it did not have both halves of that first season. And I think Solo Leveling...
Kimetsu is the same way. Like, if you just had the first half of that show for season 1, it's like, it would have been fine, but it would not have gotten to the point of like, okay, this is what this series is. Where I feel like these kinds of shows, and it's I think it would be the same thing with Frieren. Like, if Frieren had stopped at 12 or 13 episodes, it would have felt very frustrating. But 2 cores is enough for you to feel like, even if it didn't end at the perfect ending spot, it still is a very satisfying amount of story to consume that you can walk away with feeling like you've got a full meal,
Yes. Yeah. Solo Leveling. I think I talked about it a couple weeks ago on the podcast because I started watching it basically when I realized it was another Hiroyuki Sawano joint where he did the music. And it does have the most incredible banger theme song. I mean, that theme song just fucking slaps. And then the music throughout it, the full soundtrack came out a couple weeks ago and I've been listening to it and it's incredible. And that is the main reason I wanted to watch the show and my favorite thing about it, easily. I do like it though. I think it's an above average isekai, I think, in doing some fun stuff with the genre.
Yeah, it's very much a power fantasy show,
Yes.
where it's about seeing the main character, go up against something that he doesn't know how to deal with, like bang his head against it for a while, and then unlock some sort of like ridiculous power, and then absolutely devastate whatever it is he's fighting against. It's very much, I would compare it to your kind of isekai shows like an Overlord or I was reincarnated as a slime, which is probably the best of these kinds of things because that show has a bit more going on to it underneath that stuff. But it very much is about that sort of isekai fantasy where it's about the main character being ridiculously overpowered. And then even though they're ridiculously overpowered, hitting up against something that also seems ridiculously overpowered, and then the main character becomes even more ridiculously overpowered over this other ridiculously overpowered thing, right? It's just that sort of boomeranging back and forth is sort of the dynamic of the show.
One of the fun, kind of interesting things about it is this is one that is based on a South Korean novel series, and it's comic adaptation, not a Japanese piece of source material, which is kind of interesting. They chose to, I could see them having relocated it to Japan if they wanted to. So far, nothing about it is that Korea specific, but they did leave it there with the character's name still Korean and all of that, although obviously voiced by Japanese actors. And I'm curious if there's more that kind of comes from that in the future, but it makes the setting a little different. But yeah, it's a good show. I think it's very well directed. It's got the first couple of episodes are like breathtakingly violent. I kind of am amazed at just how much violence there is early on. There's some good moments throughout. I think the second to last episode, episode 11, which is where he fights the big red knight dude, has a really incredible action set piece where it's doing some really cool 3D choreography with like the setting and everything. But it definitely, I will say, like, I think the show takes about half of its entire run just to get to the basic premise because it is so complicated how he gets to the point of where he is doing his solo leveling that you're like halfway through the season by the time we're then getting into, okay, now what is he doing with the powers? And then you're ending right as we're kind of getting into that rhythm. And it is a little frustrating on that beat.
Yeah, and like these shows always do this thing where like in the background you have these like political organizations that are vying for power that have all these people that are like, oh, these are the most powerful people in the world, but you know that secretly the main character is like wildly more powerful than any of them.
Yes.
Or if he's not right now, he will be. And they will be like specks of dust in the face of this dude. And it's about, so you have the political machinations of these factions that, ultimately will be like amount to nothing in the face of the ultimate power of our protagonist. But the thing with this season, because it's only 12 episodes, you get like constant cutaways to these other characters talking through all this other stuff in the setting, and there was this island that was attacked by monsters that they sort of sacrificed, and that there were some people left behind, and they're planning on going back to that island, and that's where the season ends. Is our main dude has gone off and done this whole big fight, while all these other characters are going off to that island to go deal with this other thing, and that just stops. And it feels like very frustrating because you spent a lot of time over the course of the season in these little scenes you're constantly cutting away to build up to this thing that you don't actually see. Like, I think if you had, and I have no idea what the novels does, so I don't know if that, like, whatever happens on that island, that might be like what the entire second season is. I have no idea. But it feels like as a season, you want to see what goes on at that island. Like, that would be at least give you a sense of a bit more of a cap, because there's this whole second part of the show that gets no resolution. You get a little bit of resolution from the main character's POV, where he has kind of overcome this really incredible final trial and then gained this new ability at the end of the season. And so you get some amount of resolution there, but there's this whole other half of the show that feels like it's still in the introduction phase, let alone giving you a sense of resolution over there.
Yeah, I think I wonder if it would have been smarter just to leave a lot of that stuff out of this season, do more like his sister seems like it's going to be an important character. She's in the theme song on the swings, and but like she's kind of barely in it. There's some other characters like the guy that he is creating the guild with, and I wonder if we could have just, maybe it's not in the book, but invented even more material kind of focusing there, and like the season 2 premiere is cutting away and like showing the larger world instead, right? Or something like that. Like there's a lot of those like cutaways that sometimes are with like, they got a lot of great voice talent. Ginga Banjo is one of the big bad guys in the like, corporate ranks, and it's cool to hear his voice. Always great to hear him. But like, it does not amount to anything in this season, which again, if you're watching this 5 years from now when there's, 50 episodes of this show, it won't matter. But for now, it's a little frustrating.
Yes. One thing that did crack me up about the show, we talked about this a little bit off the air last week, is that the main character starts off the show feeling like he's very smart, right? Like the whole thing is that he's weak at the beginning, and so he's the only person who can figure this stuff out because in order to survive, he's had to use his head because he doesn't have any powers, because he hasn't gained the ability to level up, which is sort of the thing that ultimately makes him different, is that his special powers can level up in this world, nobody else's can. But he gains that ability at the end of the first arc. But once he gets the ability to level up, he slowly becomes dumber and dumber. Like, he becomes this kind of meathead eventually, which is, I think, is kind of like on purpose. I think there's a slightly kind of cheesy quality to it that I think the series does lean into. But it is very funny to me how he just slowly becomes dumber. Like, there's a moment when he first gets his ability to level up, where he's figuring out, oh, where am I going to put my stats? And he looks at his stats screen, and he just starts dumping all of his points into strength, and he looks at intellect, and he's like, I don't even know what that does. I'm not going to put any points in there. And sure enough, once you get near the end of the show, he's like, shit, I really should have put a lot more points in intellect, because I sure can't use any of my abilities worth shit anymore, because all I can do is punch things. And
it's like the serious version of Bofuri, where she just puts all her points in defense because she doesn't know any better. He should probably know better.
Yes, and it does lead to the most incredible meathead moment in the show, which is in that big last fight where he's going through and he's having to fight all these like knights in armor. And all he's ever used for most of the show is this one little dagger he got from this like serpent monster. And he realizes like, he keeps on trying to stab the dagger through their chest plate. He's like, man, this just isn't working. Oh God. It's like, I really should have come up with something else. And then his solution to this problem is he throws his dagger down and he just starts punching them and trying to pull their armor off with his bare hands, which is the most meathead solution to this, which is very funny because then eventually in the big fight at the end, he does realize the thing he needs to do is, instead of trying to stab through their armor, maybe stab like in the giant empty faceplate that has nothing there that you could just poke it through the holes, which is of course what daggers are there to do. They're there for you to wrestle your opponent and then stab them through the gaps in their armor. And it's also funny that he never thought to like buy an axe or a mace. Like, he forgets that he can buy weapons, and he's like remembers that he's like, shit, right, there was this whole store thing and I could just buy stuff. And it's very funny the way he sort of like stumbles his way through that last section, having kind of forgotten half of what he could do, and then slowly being like, I probably do need to use intellect. I probably should have more than just one weapon in case I fight something that a dagger's not good at. Maybe I should actually learn how to do these things. And that's kind of where he lands on at the end of the show.
It's definitely, I do think it is a show where the Hiroyuki Sawano soundtrack gives it a gravitas it would not otherwise have, and at some points I'm wondering if it even deserves. Like, there's the point in the middle where we get the big insert song, Dark Arise, where he has to kill all the people who have like been who were trying to kill him, and it's this incredibly violent sequence where he like cuts all their heads off, and it's a fucking amazing song that Sawano and one of his vocalists put together. But like, that is not what the show is about. Like, that feels like that should be the turning point given the gravitas of that scene, and it kind of is never brought up again. Maybe it is in future seasons. There's stuff like that. I also think like the finale, the moment where he like gets his new job and we do the whole necromancy thing, and the soundtrack there is just incredible. And again, it's one of those, and I think this sometimes with Sawano's music, where I'm like, he is so good at this, and sometimes if the material I don't think is quite on the same level, there's almost a slight mismatch there, but it's still fun to watch.
Yes, I definitely think that the production and the music and some of that stuff is like elevating what is like, entertaining, but very simple material. And to be fair, like the web novel series that this is adapting from is older, right? It's from 2016, which is earlier than like a lot of the kind of like spate of other shows that are like this. So there's something kind of fun about watching it, because it does feel like it's something from a slightly simpler time of like this sort of power fantasy show, where these shows have gotten a lot more complicated, or they have like parodies of these shows are starting to become very popular. Like there's the Eminence in the Shadow show that is basically like a parody of one of these, where the show knows the character's a complete dumbass, but he's also just impossibly powerful and nobody can stand against him, but he has no idea what the fuck is ever going on, and it's very funny. So there's something funny about watching this show, and kind of, nice about watching it and kind of feeling like it's a little bit of an artifact from an earlier period in this very particular subgenre of isekai power fantasy thing that has become very popular, so much to the point of like kind of parody and satire at this point.
It does not have pretensions. I will say, It kind of reminds me of early Sword Art Online in that way. And not just because it's also A1 Pictures, but I think it has a certain, it is not strictly reacting to the genre as it has grown up around it. It is kind of trying its own thing. And sometimes that leads to clumsiness, and sometimes it leads to, I think, real inspiration. Some of that, or it sometimes goes down directions that I don't think it quite picks up, but I think are interesting. Like the first 5 episodes feel like it is building to a sort of socioeconomic critique about how there's this whole underclass who, to survive, have to go fight in these fucking dungeons. It's like Squid Game adjacent, if you're doing, or Parasite, or other South Korean stories that have been kind of these capitalist metaphors, and then that is not a factor in the rest of the season. So and Sword Art Online does things like that too, where it touches on themes, and then you get deeper in and you're like, oh, I don't know if that was actually conscious on the part of the author, because they were actually interested in this thing over here. But so it's kind of like a clumsy show, but it's still a very entertaining one. Especially watching it when the whole season is done. It's a thing you just breeze through the whole show, because it's very propulsive, it's very well paced, outside of the fact that it just sort of feels like it stops at the end. But when you're in the middle of it, it is a very kind of good, just kind of turn it on, turn your brain off, and just kind of enjoy the big screaming action spectacle of it all. I also think the main voice actor I did want to praise, because I talked about him, I think, when I first talked about the show. I forget his name. I do think it's a good performance, because that character has to go through such a weird transformation, and I think he does it very convincingly. And so and obviously has to do a lot of crazy screaming and stuff, and is good at that. So
that voice actor is Taito Ban. He does a very good job. It is one of the other things, just reminded me saying that is incredibly funny about the show, is how undersold it is by every other character, just how insane his physical transformation is.
Yes.
He grows 2 feet taller. He gains 100 pounds in raw muscle mass. You do get a funny sequence where all the nurses at the hospital are just incredibly horny for him, which is just, it's so self-indulgent on the part of the show that it's very funny. But it's insane that his little sister does not have her mind just blown by this you're supposed to be my brother? What the fuck are you talking about? You don't look anything like him. Your face is shaped completely differently. You've got the really sharp chin that every other character had, but he had a very round face originally. Now he's got his face comes to a sharp point. He's 2 feet taller. He's just made out of muscle. His voice is an octave deeper. And she's just oh, that's weird. And then she just goes on with her day. I'm really? Wow, that's it, huh?
Maybe it'll be a twist in season 2 that the sister is some kind of agent working against him from the weird program thing, and it'll be a giant twist, because that's the only way that would make sense.
Yes. Or she just doesn't give a shit about her brother. Really, she's
true.
He's fine, whatever. And she just doesn't really care that much.
Indeed. All right, that's 2 anime. What else have you watched?
The other really big one I want to talk about, because this is the other show that I think is just phenomenal. And I feel has not gotten the kind of praise sung enough. I think because it didn't break out more into the mainstream, but it is really good. It's called The Dangers in My Heart, or Boku no Kokoro no Yabai Yatsu. It's not, I think one of the reasons it didn't break out bigger is it's not on Crunchyroll, so it's on High Dive. But it's well worth getting a month of High Dive just to watch this, really. And there's other good stuff on there, but The Dangers in My Heart is a romantic high school comedy kind of show that is just about as good as these kinds of shows get, particularly in like the current iteration of what's been popular the past few years with this genre. It's pretty interesting, I think, if you try to track what has been kind of the mainstream romantic comedy kind of trends, particularly in the kind of male-targeted half of that genre, where for a long time, the kind of default show you would get would be a harem-style comedy, where you've got a whole host of different female characters, all of them are in love with the central male character, and it's about the interplay between that, and getting, like, when your show runs out of steam, you just introduce a new female character in it, and it just kind of picks up. And that's what it was like for a long time. And I feel like the kind of defining trend of the 2020s, because we are now long enough into this decade that you can start calling it the 2020s.
We're halfway through, Sean. Yeah. That's where we are.
Yeah, the 2020s trend for this genre has more been narrowing it down to a really particular, like, one-on-one relationship between the male lead and the female lead. And then oftentimes it is there's a sort of submissive or kind of masochistic trend, I don't know how else to refer to it, where you have a whole series of shows like Teasing Master Takagi-san, there's the Nagatoro-san one, Uzaki-chan, I don't remember the full titles of all those shows, but it's like, they're always kind of named after the main female lead mostly, that are all these shows that are about like this female lead who is interested in the male lead, who's usually this kind of like very dull, passive character, and then the female lead is kind of aggressively after him in this almost kind of slightly sadistic way. And how sadistic that is, depends on the show. Like Nagatoro, it's incredibly sadistic. The Teasing Master Takagi-san is a lot lighter. But there's just been a very interesting trend of that's kind of been the dynamic, and exploring those relationships with this much more aggressive female lead and this much more submissive male lead. And Dangers in My Heart is interesting because it feels like on the surface it kind of appears to be one of those, but it's really not. And it's this incredibly well thought out, very emotionally rich relationship between the two characters. Where the basic setup is you have your male lead is this kid named Ichikawa, who is this loner, pretty smart boy who eventually kind of learned his whole thing was he was, always got gold medals on whatever project. He always participated in the science fair and all that kind of stuff and did really well. But he ended up not making it into the kind of private school that all of his other friends went to. And so he's going to this public school that he's probably a bit too smart for, but he ended up in the school and he doesn't know anybody there. And so he's ended up very alone and incredibly socially awkward and shy, and has this sort of whole complex where he thinks he's better than everybody else, where he's putting that on to sort of protect himself socially, to not make himself feel lonely. And he's also developed an interest in real crime fiction and serial killer stories and stuff like that. And so he's into this kind of grotesque, morbid stuff that also kind of pushes people away a little bit. And then you have the main female lead, who is Yamada, who is this girl who, the most sort of classic romantic comedy thing about this is that she works as a part-time model, even though she is a middle schooler, which I know, of course, obviously middle schoolers, there are models that are middle schoolers, but there's a very high percentage of these kinds of shows, much more than I imagine are in real life. But she is this girl who is very kind of bright and cheerful and very social and outgoing, but a lot of that also kind of hides her insecurities around how people think about her and stuff like that. And so they end up both spending their lunchtime in the library. Yamada, because she wants to go eat snacks, and it's the only place she can get away because she's not supposed to have these snacks at school because of the school rules. Ichikawa, because he just wants to get away from everybody else and he's just reading books in the library. And so for the first few episodes, it's got a very similar setup to some of those other kinds of romantic comedy shows where you have this very submissive male lead, this much more dominant kind of aggressive female lead who end up together alone, and is very narrowly focused on just their two interactions, which is how a lot of these kinds of shows are, where they've got a very thin supporting cast and most of it is just these two people in a room and how they go at each other. But slowly the show starts to kind of open that up into this much richer dynamic where through his relationship with Yamada, Ichikawa starts connecting with the other students in his class and starts building out this much richer kind of social life and coming out of his shell more and more. And so the thing that I think is really rich about The Dangers in My Heart is that it both has a really compelling core relationship between these two characters where they're so well written and they pair off of each other incredibly well, where you see why they like need each other because they fill in each other's gaps. Like Yamada has the social confidence that Ichikawa lacks, but Ichikawa has like the sort of like internal self-confidence, this confidence in his own intelligence and stuff like that, that is something that Yamada lacks. And so they both kind of pair off with each other really well. And then the way that kind of branches out into the larger kind of social like supporting network of the other characters in the school is really well done, and how that slowly evolves, and it just very gradually and very methodically builds out this larger world of characters from this core central relationship. And then I guess the other thing is just that relationship progresses at a way that is incredibly satisfying, because so many of these shows are like the development of the romantic relationship between the two leads is just measured in fucking millimeters. You know, it's just so slow and so gradual. Here, it's a 2 cores, basically. It was split in the middle, but it's effectively was produced as a 2-core show. There's 25 episodes. And the relationship progresses so naturally feeling that it's like, okay, like they're making really significant steps and they're growing much more intimate, and they learn a lot more about each other in this way that once you get to the end of the show, I know that there's more in the manga, but if they never make more of the show, I'd be perfectly satisfied. It has like the perfect ending point, where it feels like they have reached such a profound part in their relationship with each other because the show has not been trying to tease it out super slowly. It's got confidence to allow the relationship to really develop. And that's something that a lot of these shows just don't have the confidence to do. And this one really does. And it's really, really satisfying to see that relationship develop. And then the other thing about the show is just the production is absolutely phenomenal. It's directed by Akagi Hiroaki, who also did Teasing Master Takagi-san, if people have seen that show, which is probably my other favorite of this kind of show, which that was just phenomenal. This one is also written by Hanada Juki, who we have talked a lot about recently in the KyoAni season.
I was about to say, I was on the Wikipedia page and I saw his name and I went, that's too funny, because it's like, we have been talking about him so much, because he did a run where he wrote everything for KyoAni for a while there.
Yeah, basically he did most of KyoAni shows from like the early to mid 2010s. So he did the writing for this show, obviously adapting the manga. And so the writing for the characters is absolutely phenomenal. But the animation and the production is just fantastic. And it has a sensibility to it that feels slightly more like shoujo romance in some places. Like it does the really big, dramatic, like single frame, super detailed, like character turns around and you're just luxuriating in the expression on their face as their hair like sweeps across their face. And you just hold on that shot for like 30 seconds with like sparkles and the music going and those kind of big, dramatic, romantic, sweeping moments of emotion. That is really what I associate more with the kind of shoujo female-oriented ones of these shows. And I think it really adds something that allows itself to be really emotionally raw in those moments in a way that a lot of the more male-oriented romance shows don't often really go to. And then along that thread, the other thing that's also really good about this show is with Ichikawa, the male lead, he's so much more interesting than the male leads for these shows usually are, where they are usually just absolute blank slate, nothing characters, that they're just shy boys, and that's as far as it goes. Where Ichikawa has this really rich internal psychology, to the point where I do think, like, if you were, like, a woman watching this show, you could very much, like, I think, watch it liking Ichikawa in that sense of like as this kind of like romantic target of affection, in the way that like the boys are meant to watch this and look at Yamada and have that kind of like speak to them as this kind of like romantic target of affection. Ichikawa, I think, is attractive in this way that like women would find. He's got this kind of adorable goth boy aesthetic to him that really makes him stand out amongst these kinds of protagonists, where it feels like the mangaka cared to think through what would make this character appealing for a broader audience, not just as this kind of self-insert protagonist. He's got some of the similar traits of those sort of self-insert protagonists in that he's shy and stuff. But it does, and I'm looking it up now because I suspected, the mangaka is also a woman. So that's, I think, one of the places where that's coming from, is there's this sense of a little bit of a female gaze on Ichikawa, and it kind of is able to objectify him, is probably like slightly too strong of a term, but it's able to look at him as a romantic or sexual object in moments, which is so refreshing, because so often these shows just refuse to look at that half of the pair and just have their eyes only on the female character. Where I think what makes a romantic story really compelling is looking at the both of them and how they fill in each other's gaps and how that relationship develops from both angles, not just biasing it towards one side or the other. And so that's one of the things I think that really elevates it. So for me, I would say, like, Dangers in My Heart, if you like this kind of genre, it's a must see. I would put it up there with some of, like, the classics, modern classics of the genre, like a Toradora. I think it's kind of in that realm. Like, it's really phenomenally good. And I think the people who've seen it know that, but it definitely has not felt like it has broken out of that shell into the larger anime discussion space, at least over in the West, which is a shame, because I think there are a lot of people that would really love this show if they watched it.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think I would like this show. I know my brother would, because he watches all of these kinds of shows. You were talking about, it was funny you brought up Teasing Master Takagi-san, because he was just talking my ear off about it the other night with, he was watching the movie and, like, finishing up the show and really loving that shit. Because he is basically on a kick where he is watching everything starring Rie Takahashi, who is his favorite voice actress. Which also, by the way, because while you were talking, you mentioned that show, I looked it up. I did not realize the male lead in that show is Yuki Kaji. And I do find it very funny that his, like, two big leads in this period were fucking Eren in Attack on Titan and the boy in Teasing Master Takagi-san. Yes. That's range. Wow.
Yes. Yeah, super submissive, shy boy Nishikata from the Takagi-san show. And then, yes, like, I'm going to kill them all, Eren Yeager.
I know.
Yeah, that's very good. Yes, and if you like Takashi Rie's voice, yeah, you should watch Teasing Master Takagi-san, because it's basically like a Takashi Rie ASMR show. Like, it's like the way in which it sort of, that show is weirdly erotic in that specific way, in this ASMR kind of way, where it's so much about, like, the voice. And it feels like, yeah, it's weird. If people haven't watched it,
now you've convinced me to watch that. That sounds great. Where's that show? That's not on Crunchyroll, is it?
It's everywhere. That show is infuriating to watch, because I think literally every part of it is somewhere else. I think
Thomas was telling me about this, yes.
Netflix, one season is on Crunchyroll, and then one season in the movie is on High Dive.
Thomas was telling me this. He had to be jumping around, and he was very annoyed, but he loved the show so much he was willing to do it. Okay, that makes sense, yeah. Also, it's not under the title Teasing Master Takagi-san on Crunchyroll. It's under the Japanese title Karakai Jozu no Takagi-san, which I have to say, on the Japanese Wikipedia, or on the English Wikipedia page, has the worst literal translation I've ever seen, where they say, "Good at teasing, comma, Miss Takagi." Can you imagine, Sean, if that's what they had called it in English?
Yeah, God, that sounds like it's about the teacher or something. Good at teasing, Miss Takagi. Yeah.
Anyway, we're getting off topic, but it is funny. Anime is fun to talk about.
Yes. One other thing about Dangers in My Heart. It also has just an absolute killer opening theme, particularly for the first season. The opening theme, which is by Yorushika, that also did the second opening theme for Frieren, and they're becoming one of my new favorite Japanese bands. They did the song Shayo, or meaning setting sun, that is just fucking amazing. Like, that band Yorushika has some amazing guitar work. And that song, I've been listening to it kind of obsessively since I watched the show. So even if you don't have time to watch The Dangers in My Heart, just go to YouTube and type in Shayo and listen to that song, because it's really, really, really good.
Yes, that's awesome. Any other anime you've been watching?
I think that's the main stuff. You know, it's like, his other stuff has been Kyoto Vacation related, so yes. I think that's my main stuff.
Yeah, that's where I've been. And then I've been watching some American shows, so why don't I talk about that? We'll leap off onto that. I finally was... I have been fighting this for months, but I finally was pressured into buying a fucking Netflix account for myself, because they did that password crackdown, and I have not been able to use my family's Netflix from here. And so for all, I was like, fuck you, Netflix doesn't have anything I want. And then they slowly got more and more stuff I wanted, and I went, I can resist. And then finally they got Ripley, which is the show I want to talk about. And I was finally like, fuck it, the thing that had kept stopping me from getting Netflix so I could watch some stuff was I would always go to sign up, and I would get immediate sticker shock at the prices for the non-ad tiers, which are ludicrous now. They're $16 or $23 if you want 4K. And I finally went, you know what? The ad tier is $6.99. It is less than half the price of the next tier. fuck it. If the ads annoy me, I can upgrade. Let's try it. And I am happy to say, I get almost no ads on that ad tier. I do not understand the economics of it, because I watched the entire 8 episodes of Ripley, and I had maybe like 3 minutes of ads total in all of that. So like, whatever they're doing, it's fine. It's also, they are done less intrusively than on other platforms. It feels like they have actually like found places in the shows to put the ads that will not make you go, what the fuck, it cut in the middle of someone's word. They actually, it's not like, Ripley is not shot with ad breaks, but same with the other stuff I've watched. So anyway, if you want to save some money, that's nice. I do kind of wonder, this is off topic, I am curious what tiers streamers make more money from. Do they make more money from the crazy expensive non-ad tiers that give us all sticker shock? Or do they actually make more from the ad tiers where people pay less, but then if you watch enough, you get the ad revenue? Like, obviously, if you get the $6.99 tier and barely watch anything, they're only making $6.99 off that. But if you watch a ton of shit, they might be making more than $15. I'm actually kind of curious what the economics of that are. I will never know, but I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
Anywho.
I mean, I'm vastly curious about the economics of all these streaming services.
Yes.
And clearly they are as well, because they have not yet sort of figured out how do we run these as a long-term profitable venture.
Well, Netflix has done way better. This is an interesting story. It was in kind of a free fall. Since it introduced its ad tier, it has done better. It has entered more profitability. And I just do wonder, like, for one, their prices without ads had gotten to the point where I think it was genuinely freezing people like me out. Like, it's not just that I'm a cheapskate. That's a lot of money. Like, if you want to, $23 a month is crazy for a service like this. But $6.99 is something people can actually fucking afford. So I do wonder if that combined with the ads, I just think we're moving to a model where ads are just going to be kind of reintroduced into everything, because that's how TV ran for a really long time and it was profitable. And I think that's where we are. In any case, I got my cheap-ass Netflix and watched Ripley. Ripley is the new show created by Steven Zaillian, who is incredible. He's had such a weird career. He, like, one of the first scripts he ever wrote that was a movie was Schindler's List, which he got an Oscar for. He's directed several movies like Looking for Bobby Fischer. He's written movies like Moneyball, which is one of my favorites from the 2010s. Lots and lots of stuff. He did his first TV show a couple years ago was The Night Of, which was an HBO show that people really liked, in a miniseries. And then this is the latest adaptation of The Talented Mr. Ripley, the Patricia Highsmith novel that introduced the Tom Ripley character, who has been in a bajillion film adaptations. There's been at least 2 other films of Talented Mr. Ripley, a French film, and then the one with Matt Damon from the 90s. And I have not seen or read any of the Ripley stuff before. I mainly wanted to watch this because A, I think Steven Zaillian is a really interesting writer and director. B, Andrew Scott is in it. And while Andrew Scott was introduced to me and the world is the most annoying take on Moriarty ever in the BBC Sherlock, I feel like that did him a disservice, because ever since that show went off the air, he has been one of like the greatest actors on earth, just in everything he's done. If you haven't seen season 2 of Fleabag, see season 2 of Fleabag and a lot of other stuff he's done. I mean, he was in the movie last year, All of Us Strangers, that was incredibly acclaimed. He's a phenomenal actor, and he plays Tom Ripley here. And then also it is shot entirely in black and white. And look, if you promise me a slow, methodical crime drama shot entirely in black and white, I will sign up for any service. I am weird that way. That sounds like my jam. This is very much, if you were like me, you watched Better Call Saul, and you dreamed for the time when Better Call Saul would do full black and white episodes, and then when they finally did do the full black and white episodes, you went, God, I wish someone would just do a full show like this in black and white. Here you go. That is Ripley on Netflix. Like I said, it is a new adaptation of The Talented Mr. Ripley. It's just that one book over 8 episodes, but it does not... It's not that it doesn't feel drawn out, but it feels drawn out in exactly the ways it is intending to be drawn out, which is to say it is very procedure focused in the way like Breaking Bad and especially Better Call Saul were. Like, if you like the episode of Better Call Saul in season 3 where Mike is trying to figure out how Gus is tracking him, and there's like a 20-minute sequence of him taking apart his car to try to find the bug, you will like Ripley. It is that kind of like very procedure focused crime show, but also with a real touch of dark humor to it. And it is gorgeously shot. The cinematographer on this show was Robert Elswit, who people would know as the cinematographer for most of Paul Thomas Anderson's movies, including There Will Be Blood. So he is like literally one of the greatest cinematographers working in Hollywood. He shot the entire show. Steven Zaillian wrote and directed the whole thing, and it is all shot in this really gorgeous black and white. I've seen some people describe it as noirish. That's wrong. If you're just saying it's noirish because it's in black and white, that's not what noir means. Noir means like a specific high contrast black and white, like The Third Man or something. This is much, or Citizen Kane. This is much more like, I would say, mid 20th century, 50s and 60s kind of European black and white, almost like an Antonioni film, or I would say European periods, Orson Welles. There's a lot of that in here. But it is stunningly gorgeous. The frames are just, every frame in this thing could be a great photograph all on its own. It's all shot on location in different European locations. It looks way more expensive than it must have been just because it does such a good job doing all the period detail. They've kept the story set when it was written by Patricia Highsmith in the 1960s. So it is a period piece that, I mean, the story could not be done today because all of Tom's crimes rely on like using passport photos and not having the internet. So you really could not set it today. And so it's all of that. And like, that is the thing that got me into it at first. It is just such a fucking gorgeous show. Even Netflix's terrible compression cannot ruin how good it looks. But then it is also beautifully directed and acted and everything. It is such a good telling of the basic story. From what I can tell, if you've seen other versions of Talented Mr. Ripley, I have not gone and seen the movies yet, although now I'm interested in that. It seems like this is the more faithful adaptation. I know the movie with Matt Damon made more changes. This seems like it is fairly close to what the book did, although the big difference is that Andrew Scott is quite a bit older than other versions of Ripley from this book have been. And so it has a slightly different valence there, but everyone in the show is amazing. There is, I was actually very surprised. One of the main characters is played by Dakota Fanning, who I have not seen as an adult actor yet. Her sister, Elle Fanning, has been in more stuff lately, but Dakota Fanning was like the kid actor in everything when you and I were little, Sean. And she plays Marge Sherwood, who is the girlfriend of Dickie Greenleaf, who is the person Tom Ripley is sent to Italy to try to find. And Tom Ripley, if you don't know this character in the books, is basically a low-level con man who becomes a high-level serial killer. And that is what the story is about. And Johnny Flynn plays Dickie Greenleaf. Great performance from that actor. I don't think I'd seen him in anything before. I know he's been in some other stuff that people have liked him in, but I had not seen him before. And he is really extraordinary in this show. But the entire cast is, eventually in the later episodes, you get an Italian actor named Maurizio Lombardi, who plays Inspector Ravini, who is the Italian inspector on Tom's trail. And he might be the best performance in the whole show. Just incredibly entertaining sort of detective performance as like a guy who is very smart and very put upon and having to deal with this crazy Tom Ripley dude. But yeah, I don't want to say too much in case you have never seen the story of the Talented Mr. Ripley. Like I knew through osmosis some movements of the plot, but it is, you know, it's not a show like if you have the plot spoiled, you won't enjoy. Obviously, it has been adapted multiple times for the stage and screen, but it's outstanding. It carries through all the way. There are two episodes in particular, the third episode and the fifth episode, which both involve Tom doing a particular crime, and the entire hour is about how he does the crime. That are two of my favorite episodes of TV since Better Call Saul went off the air, and very much in that vein of like, we are methodically going to go through this piece by piece, and it is absolutely brilliant, but I think it leads to a great ending and everything. I really, really hope they do multiple seasons, because Patricia Highsmith wrote 5 of these books, and they've been kind of inconsistently adapted over time. I would love to see this cast, particularly Andrew Scott, do more of this. I don't know if Steven Zaillian will want to. He is 71 years old, and this show took like 5 years to make. So he has said it's just kind of a matter of, you know, energy and life on Earth, whether he wants to do more. But it is fantastic. It's one of my favorite things I've ever seen from Netflix. Although I will note, if you're watching this and going, this doesn't really feel like a Netflix show, that's because it's not. It was made for Showtime, and then Showtime has basically stopped making original programming other than, and I'm not joking here, they've said this as their business model, other than spin-offs of existing shows. Like they're planning to do a Dexter prequel. They're planning to do multiple spin-offs of Billions, including shows called Millions and Trillions. Not a joke. They are planning to make those shows. It is the funniest thing in the world. Sean is burying his head in his hands. Had you heard that before, Sean?
No, I had not heard that before, because I was seconds away from saying, "Oh, I think the spinoffs. I think it's going to be Millions. It's going to be a prequel." Yes. Apparently, that's what they're doing.
They're doing that, Sean. We are in the end times. So anyway, they dumped the show. Netflix picked it up. I think it's a bit of a bummer this went to Netflix, because I think if this had been on HBO Sunday nights, as you know, in the same spot that like Succession and The Last of Us have been really big lately, and airing week to week, I think this show would have broken out. Maybe it's doing well on Netflix. I don't know. It's kind of impossible to tell when they do these binge drop models. But like, it would have been very satisfying in that form, and I think it probably would have had a better shot at having a future. But in any case, it tells the story so perfectly that even if there is not more, it is still great. I absolutely adored this show.
Awesome. I mean, it sounds amazing. Like, I still need to get around to Better Call Saul. That's definitely like a summer project for me at this point, because I've been meaning to get to that show, and then maybe I can just throw this onto the end of that.
Again, if you get through the end of Better Call, because Better Call Saul has these flash forwards at the end of every season that are in black and white to Saul's life after the events of Breaking Bad. That's not a spoiler. It's the first scene of the show.
And I already knew that.
Yes, and then eventually the show catches up, and the final episodes of Better Call Saul are entirely in black and white in the future timeline, which was like just absolute crack in my veins for me. I loved it so much. That show is so gorgeous, even more so in black and white. And if you get through that and you're like, I need more, I would immediately recommend Ripley. Obviously, they are different shows in a whole lot of ways, but there's a real affinity there that I think is really cool. And yeah, this is one of my favorite American shows I've seen in years, so loved it. The other show I started watching last night, and I probably won't watch any more of because it bored me to tears, was Three Body Problem. I was curious about this because this is Netflix's like latest, we spent $500 million on this show. That might be an exaggeration, but also I know that involved, this is written by Benioff and Weiss, the guys who did Game of Thrones, and I think they are under a like $250 million overall deal at Netflix, and that does not count the actual production budget for this show. So this show might well have cost like $500 million. It does not look it. But anyway, Three Body Problem, it's based on the books that are, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the author's name. I'm not good at Chinese pronunciations. But it's the same author who wrote The Wandering Earth, and he's one of the most, famous sci-fi authors in the world today. And this series of books, which is also known as the Remembrance of Earth's Past series, have been, very big hits all over the world. And there actually was a full Chinese TV show based on the trilogy of books that aired last year. It was one of those, this is how a lot of Chinese dramas works. They just make a giant number of episodes and then put them all out at once. So that show is 30 episodes, and it has been subtitled. It's on Amazon Prime, and I believe it's also on Peacock, but that's irrelevant because no one has Peacock. But you might have Amazon Prime. So I have it, and I honestly, if I'm interested in this story, I will probably go watch the Chinese show because that was actually pretty acclaimed, at least in China when it aired. The Netflix show, like I said, it's adapted by Benioff, Weiss, and then another creator, Alexander Wu, who they are working with on this one. It is full of Game of Thrones alums, like John Bradley, who played Sam, Liam Cunningham, Jonathan Pryce. A lot of people are in this. The other reason I was interested in it is Benedict Wong is one of the main characters, and I always love me some Benedict Wong. I also did realize watching this show that he is British. I had no idea. I always thought he was American because his American accent is so good. I probably should have been clued in by the fact that his name is Benedict, which is a super British name. But like, watch him in Doctor Strange next to the other Benedict, Cumberbatch. Whose accent is shakier? Like, Benedict Cumberbatch has a pretty shaky American accent. Benedict Wong's is rock solid. This is a tangent, but,
yes,
it's interesting.
No, but you were right. He's named Benedict. And yes, if you're watching Doctor Strange, you're watching two British men named Benedict, both pretending to have American accents. One of them is better than the other.
One of them is better than the other.
Yes, it is definitely Benedict Wong has the better American accent.
Even though in the story of Doctor Strange, neither of them really need to be American. They're both fucking wizards. It does not really matter, right?
Yeah.
Anyway.
It's funny because I always assumed, when I read the comics, I thought Doctor Strange was supposed to be a British character because it just seemed like he looks like he's kind of Britishy. Like, I don't know if Stephen spelled PH is more common in Britain or not, but I've always just kind of associated that spelling as the more Britishy of the two Stephens. And so I just always thought that Doctor Strange was supposed to be British, and then they cast Benedict Cumberbatch and made him speak American. I'm like, oh, I guess I was wrong the whole time.
Yes. Anyway, we're getting off track, and maybe I'm getting off on tangents because the 2 episodes of Three Body Problem I watched, both of which are over a full hour long. Here's the thing. I think it's okay to make episodes of TV that are over an hour if you are later in the show's run and have earned the privilege. Like, Ripley does have its later episodes, like its finale is 75 minutes, and I think the one before it is 60 minutes. But the ones before that are like 45 to 50 minutes. So it earns getting to go over an hour. Better Call Saul never made an episode over an hour until it got to season 4. Like, I think it's okay to go over an hour if you have earned the audience's interest. If you start a show with episodes that are over an hour long, you can go fuck yourself. And that is very much my feeling on Three Body Problem, because I watched over a feature-length film's worth of this thing last night. I watched 2 full hours, and the story hasn't started yet. I don't know what the plot of this show is. I have no idea. I went and looked up, like, the back of the fucking cover of the book on Amazon, and I'm like, what's this book about? And it told me more than these 2 episodes did. It's very weird, because I wanted to see this, because I've liked the other adaptations of the author, Liu Cixin, again, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. Like the Wandering Earth movies, I think are very interesting, and I've read some of his short stories, and I think he's a good author. So I kind of wanted to see. I was curious, because this is like Netflix's big show of the year. I was curious how it would be, and it's honestly kind of a disaster. I think the parts of the show, which is most of it, that are in English and set mainly in England, are almost unwatchably bad. Like, even with some very good actors on screen, like, it is mostly incoherent. I think it's pitched in a really weird way where, like, the first episode ends with this absolutely crazy thing happening where all the stars in the sky start flickering on and off, which would be like a signal of the end times, right? Mm-hmm. Like, all of humanity, like, there would be cars crashed into every building on the street. It would be crazy, right? And the next episode starts and people are like, did you catch the stars flicker last night? That was weird. And they're like having water cooler conversations. It's like that kind of, it is so miscalibrated in tone. The story involves this like VR headset that these characters are asked to like play a game in that is rehearsing basically the 3-body problem of the title, that is about this oncoming alien invasion. That is pitched, I think, very weird, and I don't think it has any sense of tone with that. All of that's bad. The parts of it that are decent, that I was actually interested in, are the parts that are set in China in the 1960s during the Cultural Revolution and performed in Chinese. And those are the only parts that are good, which probably tells me I should just go watch the Chinese adaptation of the show that is better. Because one of the other things they've done, and I have not read the books, but to my understanding, they have basically taken the main character from the book, split him into like 5 or 6 characters so that they can have more of an international cast that is not entirely set in China. Because if they were doing that, there'd be no point to make the show. The Chinese show already exists. So they've done that. That's not like an inherently terrible idea, but it makes it, at least through these 2 episodes, it has the Game of Thrones problem on steroids, where like Game of Thrones has a million characters it jumps between. This has a million characters it jumps between, but it's not people in like a medieval kingdom where the power structures are clear and the characters are like vivid and interesting and written by George R. R. Martin and played by actors like Peter Dinklage and Sean Bean, so you like immediately get a sense of who they are. They're just they're all physicists. And they're all physicists who are getting messages. And so it's very boring jumping around. It's completely incoherent. This is not really a review of the show because, again, I only watched 2 episodes. I probably will not watch more. It bored me to tears. And that is, from what I can tell, the main reaction to the show, because I did tweet. I didn't even tweet about the show. I tweeted about Netflix's terrible compression, which makes the show look awful. And someone immediately went, yeah, but the show is also very bad. So, so I immediately got responses like that. So, yeah, I don't think this show is the hit that Netflix wanted or needed. Maybe the last couple seasons of Game of Thrones should have been a clue not to give those guys $250 million. But, hey, I don't control the money.
Yeah. My parents watched some amount of Three Body Problem, but my sense was that they did not particularly like it, because I don't think they ended up watching all of it, and my parents watch everything. So
for all the problems Benioff and Weiss have as writers, I thought they would at least be better at like getting into the story, because the beginning of Game of Thrones is very confident and capable as an introduction to the world. This is not that. Like, it honestly feels like they are pretty confused about how to adapt the story and how they're going to jump around in time, how they're going to connect things, what the tone is. It just feels like a show where, like, the material got away from everyone involved. And whatever, and I know it's a very complex book. It's extra complex when you are trying to adapt it from China to a larger, like, international story, but because it involves things like the Chinese Cultural Revolution, they have to keep it somewhat rooted in China. At a certain point, I would have just been like, why didn't Netflix just buy the rights to that Chinese show and air it? They are lots of international stuff that is a hit. Squid Game was South Korean, and there is a dub, but I don't think people watched the Squid Game dub. It sounded like it was terrible, and it was a huge hit. I don't really get this.
Yeah, I did not know that there was a Chinese version of it, because now I want to watch that, because I heard some scuttlebutt about Three Body Problem before the series launched, and I was like, oh, that seems kind of interesting. And then I very quickly lost interest once I heard vague impressions of the show, like from my parents and stuff. But yeah, hey, one of my favorite TV shows of all time is the Chinese adaptation of Romance of the Three Kingdoms. So, well, one of the Chinese adaptations of Romance of the Three Kingdoms was the MIDI.
Yes.
But the 1990s one. So, and it's been a while since I watched a Chinese TV show. So I might check that out, because that sounds a lot more interesting.
And a lot of those Chinese shows we don't ever get localized here. Like, we're still waiting for Wong Kar-wai made his first TV show this year that aired Blossom Shanghai, and that has not been localized anywhere. But again, it's on Amazon, or if you're an absolute pervert, Peacock. It is over there as well.
I might just go to Peacock just to see. I think we have it, or I have like access to it through my parents, who have access through like some sort of cable something or other.
That's the only way anyone has Peacock, yes. Sean. No one has ever gone to Peacock, and I'm kidding. I have, because they had Poker Face, which was great. But still, that service is worth making fun of, because they called it Peacock, if for no other reason.
I remember being like, oh, I'll watch some old episodes of Law & Order, and then being baffled by that not all of the episodes of Law & Order were on there. There was a small selection. I'm like, what? How do you not... This is like the NBC show, Law & Order. Like, how do you not have every episode of Law & Order on here? Why is it only like everything from like 2000 on or something? It's like none of like the classic era of Law & Order is really there.
Yeah.
And I was bummed out that I didn't watch any. So
that is the non-Japanimation Station-related TV I have been watching lately, and not dissertation-related TV I've been watching lately. I have been watching other things. I'm just not going to talk about them here. Sean, what other stuff have you been up to before we get into some video game stuff?
I think it's just the video game stuff, other than it was a lot of anime and then some video games. All
right. Well, do you have anything other than Final Fantasy?
Yes, I want to touch on some Dragon Ball Z Kakarot.
Go for it.
What I was playing. So I talked about it briefly last podcast, that I faced with the choice paralysis of all the different games to play. I was like, I'll just play Dragon Ball Z Kakarot instead. which is what I often do.
To be clear, you had already played. You beat that game years ago when it came out.
Yes. But that's like a go-to for me, is like, oh man, that's like, I have all these things I could be doing. What if I just watched Dragon Ball again, though? It's kind of a classic me thing. So this time it was, why don't I play some Dragon Ball? So I played through Kakarot, but the big thing was then they have done a lot of DLC for that game. Because there was a first season pass from around when it launched, which had 3 DLC things, one of which is very, very loosely based on Battle of Gods. Like, on Wikipedia, it says, it's includes transformations and characters seen in Battle of Gods and covers the events of the movie. I would not include the second part of that sentence. It does not cover the events of the movie. You could not in any reasonable way describe it that way. It just has the transformations, and you fight Beerus and Whis. Then there's the second one from the first season pass, which is Resurrection F. That does have, at least you fight Golden Frieza. So yes, that is based on the events of Resurrection F, I think is a fair way to describe that. And then the third and important one from the first season pass is History of Trunks. And then they did a second season of DLC that started January 2023. Keep in mind that Dragon Ball Kakarot came out January 2020. So 3 years after the launch of the game, they decided, fuck it, let's do a second DLC pass, which is crazy. And that includes Bardock. So a Bardock adaptation of that OVA, then an adaptation of the 23rd World Tournament, which is the final arc of original Dragon Ball, the tournament with not Demon King Piccolo, but my junior Piccolo. And then it wrapped up in February, so this is very current somehow, is Goku's Next Journey, which is an adaptation of the End of Z, the epilogue of the original Dragon Ball Z.
Which was not in the main game. Where does the main game end?
The main game just ends with Goku throwing the spirit bomb at Kid Buu and going, I hope you come back as like a cool dude. Bye-bye. And then you have like a bunch of side missions you can do. But it does not go to Oob and all of that. So it never covers that section. And I do not know if they're going to say, oh, fuck it, we'll do a third, because obviously there's like all these movies, there's other Dragon Ball Super arcs, there's other original Dragon Ball arcs. I would be interested to see if they just say, yeah, fuck it, let's just keep pumping out the Kakarot DLC, because they just also recently announced more Xenoverse 2 DLC, where they're putting in Android 18 from Dragon Ball Super and Videl from Dragon Ball Super, which is, cool. Like, I'm happy to have more Videl, but also Videl never fights in Dragon Ball Super, so it's a confusing conclusion.
That game came out in October 2016. It came out before Trump was elected president. That's how old that fucking game is. And Dragon Ball Super started in 2015. Dragon Ball Super is 10 years old next year. Yeah. We're fucking old.
Yes. Dragon Ball Xenoverse 2 is so old that, like, the Super Saiyan Blue transformations in there originally were just the Resurrection F ones. Like, that's like where they had those specific outfits from Resurrection F. That's how old Xenoverse 2 is. Anyways, we're not here to talk about Xenoverse 2. We're here to talk about the DLC for Dragon Ball Z Kakarot. So the first two DLCs are very much whatever. The Battle of Gods and Resurrection F1, they are basically like fight Whis over and over again to power level your character to then unlock the Super Saiyan God transformation, and then eventually the Super Saiyan God Super Saiyan transformation, as they always put it in the games. And with, like, you get a Golden Frieza boss fight. They're very thin. They're kind of fun purely from the perspective of they allow you to just absolutely jack up the level on your characters to an insane degree. Like, you play that DLC for about 20 minutes or so, and your characters will be at about level 250, which is what you need to be to get Super Saiyan Blue. It does also include the funniest moment in any Dragon Ball game in recent memory to me, where, for whatever reason, the Dragon Ball games have this insistence on always calling Super Saiyan Blue Super Saiyan God Super Saiyan in the UI and stuff. It's SSGSS, even though nobody has ever referred to it that way in the show or anything since the movie Resurrection F, in which it was introduced. And you have this scene that they adapt from Resurrection F, where they turn Super Saiyan Blue, and Whis looks at them and goes, you're Super Saiyan gods who have attained the power of Super Saiyan. But that sure is a mouthful to say. Let's just call it Super Saiyan Blue. And as soon as he says that, a text box appears on screen that says, you've unlocked the transformation Super Saiyan God Super Saiyan. And I bounced through my controller at the wall, because it's like, Whis just said that that's a dumb name that is like way too much, and said Super Saiyan Blue is better, and yet still you insist on calling it Super Saiyan God Super Saiyan in all the UI for the game. It's very weird. I don't know why they do that. But that's those first two DLCs. They're not, they're fine for what they are. They're not like something I'd go out my way to play. But the third DLC, Trunks the Warrior of Hope, which is an adaptation of a couple of things. It's an adaptation of the OVA, The History of Trunks. It's an adaptation of the section from Dragon Ball Z where Trunks goes back to his future and defeats the androids in the cell, which that was never actually done in the base game. And then it also includes, and this is really interesting, an adaptation of the Dragon Ball Super manga arc, where you get a more detailed version of the thing that the anime also explained to you in the Goku Black section, where Trunks describes how the Majin Buu stuff went down from his perspective, which is that the Supreme Kai and Kibito came down, they grabbed him, they said, hey, this shit's going to go down, you need to train with the Z-Sword. Trunks trains with the Z-Sword, they go to fight Dabura and Babidi before Majin Buu is resurrected. Dabura kills Kibito and almost kills Supreme Kai, causing Trunks to go Super Saiyan 2 and kill Dabura and Babidi before Majin Buu is resurrected. And that is adapted in this DLC, and it's really cool. Good. It's the History of Trunks DLC. It is better than the base game. It's really phenomenally well done, because it's quite long. It's probably like 6 to 8 hours of material. And it's much denser than the base game, because Dragon Ball Z Kakarot is a fun game. I like it a lot, but it is also spread very thin, because it's one game adapting the entirety of Dragon Ball Z from Raditz to Buu. Like, that's a lot for one game to do. And you definitely get the feeling at a certain point, once you get into the Android stuff, that the expensive cutscenes and some of that kind of stuff and the more elaborate boss fights, they start becoming like a little bit fewer and further between compared to the Saiyan and Namek stuff, where it was a little bit more like, oh, every major fight's going to get a little bit of extra love. on how it's presented. And then it's, once you get to the big Perfect Cell fight, yeah, that's going to have a lot of production behind it. But everything else doesn't really get that. The History of Trunks DLC, though, it feels like every moment just gets a really nice, big, beautifully rendered and directed 3D cutscene from CyberConnect 2, which they are so good at this. And it feels a lot more like some of like the later Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm games that had that sense of, man, they have spent a lot of time making these cool, crazy 3D cutscenes that look just awesome in their engine. And so all the big moments from all three of those pieces of Future Trunks stuff just get these really awesome rendered cutscenes that aren't just being like shot for shot those moments from the OVA or anything. They take a lot of their cues from the OVA, but they also find moments to put their own original spin on it, which is the thing that I think really makes it much more entertaining as a Dragon Ball fan, because I like to see the slightly different interpretation of the material that they are able to do. And then also just the way that they designed the fights, like fighting Android 17 and 18 in the future as future Gohan and Trunks. Like, that's some of the best fights in the game. Like, the way they designed that boss fight is incredibly fun. And then they also find all these moments to add in little touches of story around the edges. Like, there's this whole kind of running subplot around Chi-Chi from the future, where Trunks kind of goes and helps her out bit by bit, and you get a little bit of her kind of perspective on things. And obviously there's everything that happens with Gohan from the future that's really like devastating when you think about it from the Chi-Chi POV, which you never get in that OVA. You never really see much of the other side characters. You get a little bit of like Master Roshi here and there. Obviously most of the characters in Dragon Ball are dead by the time you're in Future Trunks, so the few that are the survivors, they find little moments with little side quests and stuff to give you some insight into that world and flesh out the edges. And then it finds such a good spine of a story to tell, from Trunks being this little kid that Gohan's trying to train desperately, and sort of puts him as like, you are our spark of hope that we have for a brighter future. And that you kind of follow that thread all the way through to the lasting piece, if you ignore that Goku Black's eventually going to happen. But for the sake of this story, the lasting piece he wins by defeating Dabura when it's just him, right? And he accomplishes that without having to go to the past and do the Goku, Gohan, and all that stuff. He's just able to sort of, with the help of other people from his timeline, protect the timeline that he's in. It's a really great interpretation of that story. And if you, like, people are fans of Dragon Ball, I would highly, highly, highly recommend you play this. You don't even need to play the base game. Like, you can just go to the menu and just pick History of Trunks DLC and just play it from there. And it's
might do that.
Yeah, it's so cheap to get when it's on sale, because again, this is from the first season pass. That it's a well worth playing on its own. It's very fun, and it's got a tutorial built into the DLC also. So like, even if you haven't played the base game, you can still kind of get up to speed on how to play the combat and stuff.
It's also bundled into the Switch version if you have that. Like, you can't buy it without it. So I have it on Switch, and it's just in there, built in.
Yeah, awesome. So History of Trunks, great DLC. I think kind of like a must play if you're a big Dragon Ball fan. And then the second season pass DLCs are generally quite good. None of them are as good as the History of Trunks one, but none of them are also as kind of like big as that. So you have the Bardock one is fun. They don't find as much sort of extra space to kind of fill in gaps around the edges there, which would have been... I wish that they found a little bit more to do, because you've got the whole squad of other Saiyans with Bardock. And to be clear, this is the OVA version, so it's not like Dragon Ball Super Broly. This is kind of like the traditional Broly or Bardock story. And so you've got his whole squad of Fascia and all those other Saiyans. And you get a little bit with them, but I would have loved for them to fill in some more stuff, because there's definitely room. Seeing what they did with History of Trunks, they could have done more. But it still is a very fun, interesting DLC that does have some new kind of battle types in there as you're wiping out huge swarms of random alien dudes. Like, they have those guys who give Bardock his weird precognitive powers or whatever, and you just wipe out like an entire city of those dudes, and that's kind of cool. It's very different than those battles in the base game. So the Bardock one is fun, not necessarily amazing. The 23rd World Tournament one, though, that one's really cool, because you just never see this adapted in Dragon Ball games almost ever. They're obviously contemporaneously in the 80s on like the Famicom, you had some original Dragon Ball games. And then there have been a few like throwback games here and there, or like Budokai Tenkaichi 3 had some original Dragon Ball characters in there, but you just almost never see this stuff adapted. And the love and care they put into adapting it, it's really cool. Like, the art style is very different. So like it's a whole different Goku model. It's a whole different Piccolo model. Like they make them look like the characters from that section of the manga with the much more rounded edges, rounder eyes, right? They don't have the kind of really sharp, kind of Arnold Schwarzenegger-y big defined muscles. It's the more kind of lean muscle mass stuff. It's fairly brief because of course there aren't really that many fights. I mean, Goku fights 3 people. He fights Chi-Chi, he fights Tenshinhan, and then he fights Piccolo, and then they extend the Piccolo fight as you would want to because that has a lot of phases. And there are some like sort of little one-off fights you can do. They do have you play as Tenshinhan fighting Cyborg Tao Pai Pai, which is fun. So there's a little bit of extra stuff than just the Goku fights. But overall, it's fairly thin. But the thing that they're able to do is change the combat up a lot, because the base game, all the combat is you're flying. Well, you can't do that in the 23rd World Tournament because the payoff at the end of that tournament arc is that's the first time Goku flies, and that's how he beats Piccolo, because he's been disabled basically, and then he's able to use the Bugujutsu flying technique.
He's been disabled basically means Piccolo has systematically broken every one of his limbs and shot a giant hole through his shoulder. It's grisly.
It's very brutal, and all that shit happens. They also start the DLC with you play through little kid Goku fighting Demon King Piccolo. Because, of course, there's a continuity there, because that's also what happens to Goku at the end of the Demon King Piccolo arc, but he leaves one hand free, so Goku Kamehamehas up and fucking does the grossest thing in the history of Dragon Ball when you try to think about it, which Goku propels himself physically through Demon King Piccolo's body, which he should be covered in just absolute blood and guts if he had done that, but of course, it's not that kind of manga, but... So
it's not Berserk.
Yes. So you do start with that fight as like your tutorial, which is cool, and then it uses that to kind of give you your full come around story to Goku winning the fight with Bukujutsu at the end. But that means that you have these grounded battles that change the dynamic of the combat, and honestly, I think the combat is better that way. It's a little bit more thoughtful, and you have to use a bit more kind of strategy. It's less charge up, just fire 1,000 Kamehamehas and win, where there's a certain appeal to that, and that can be kind of fun. But the combat gets very kind of dumb in the base game at a certain point because you're so wildly too powerful. Whereas this DLC, it does make you have to think a little bit more. It plays slightly more like the Naruto games, and they kind of like pulled a little bit of that feel in here. And it's also fun because you get very used to in the base game where you're doing attacks that are dealing like 2 million damage and stuff like that, where the numbers pop up on the screen because it's an RPG. And so then when you start this DLC and you're fighting as Goku versus Demon King Piccolo and you punch him and it does like 3 damage, it's very satisfying. It's a really clever way of using the RPG mechanics of where when you play as Goku in the tournament, like 1,000 damage is a crazy amount of damage you're dealing, and that is an incredibly fun way of scaling up the powers, of being like, oh yeah, Super Saiyan 3 Goku a punch is like 100,000 points of damage, whereas like you could never even dream of that with the characters in this DLC. So it's the 23rd World Tournament one. Again, not as like elaborate and fleshed out as the Trunks one, but still very fun, and I think also, especially if you have the DLC, just well worth a play. It's maybe like 3 hours long for if you try to do every little tiny thing in it. But that is very fun, especially if you like original Dragon Ball stuff. And then you get End of Z, or the Goku's Next Journey one. This one is probably the weakest of the second batch of DLCs, partially because what it's adapting from the manga is a very kind of thin part of story. It doesn't have as much richness as the Bardock story or the tournament story from Dragon Ball. But it is still fun. You get a lot of little kid Pan, which is good. You get some Goku just grilling the shit out of Goten, who has just let himself completely go, and that's very amusing. And you do get to just marvel at adult Goku, played by Masako Nozawa, fully adult married adult Gohan, played by Masako Nozawa, and then teen Goten. And that's not a combination of Masako Nozawas you get very often. And so it's, as just a Masuka Nozawa appreciation trip, which is partly what Dragon Ball Z Kakarot sort of feels like as a game sometimes. The End of Z DLC does have like some fun stuff there. You do get the fight with Oob, I think is very fun, and honestly I think kind of does it in a way that's a little bit more interesting than like the anime. Like it feels like kind of fleshes out that fight, because it's like, I mean, it's the big fight for the DLC, so they put their time and energy into it. And so I do really like that moment, and what they do with that fight and kind of fleshing it out. And then they have a bunch of side stuff, and that's kind of the biggest part of it, because that Oob thing is very quick. It takes you less than an hour to get through all of that. But there's a bunch of like other side missions. You unlock some different new attacks for Goku that you can then bring back into the base game if you wanted to as well. And there's a big sequence where you fight Vegeta, which feels kind of like the capper for the game. Like if they don't do another piece of DLC, like this feels like this is their, hey, this is Dragon Ball Z Kakarot. You go back to the Wastelands, you do a big fight with Vegeta. It's big crazy. It's in a wholly original storyline with this sort of fight between the two of them. That's very cool. It goes through all these different phases. You get to see them like power up and, you know, just say like, yeah, fuck it, Super Saiyan 2 Vegeta. Vegeta just has like Super Saiyan 2 the fuck out of Super Saiyan 2, and it's as good as Super Saiyan 3 Goku. Who cares? And they just, you know, beat the shit out of each other, and it's fun. So, yeah, so that last DLC, not a must play necessarily like the World Tournament and Trunks one, but, you know, it's still a good time. And overall, if you ignore the first two DLCs, which are very thin, and honestly, they should probably have been free, like there's so little to them. All the other DLCs are really good, and in many ways, like I think are a step above the base game, because they get to be so dense and they get that higher production value per game like hour compared to the base game. So I had a very fun time going through and playing all those DLCs, but I really have to stress that Trunks one is a step above. Like that Trunks one is really good, and it just makes you appreciate the storyline and the character of future Trunks and future Gohan in a slightly different way. It gave me a different perspective on that story, which is kind of what I want from these sorts of games, and from the adaptation of that material. And the fact that they spent the time to really give that the extra polish and that step above. If people have not played it, I would definitely seek that DLC out.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's really cool to hear. And just that game has been supported to a degree that, like, other than Xenoverse 2, I can't think of many anime games that have been kind of had that long of a shelf life, you know?
Yes, to getting like a big elaborate DLCs 4 years after their releases. Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, so that's really cool. I want to talk about a video game thing that I am super into. I finally this week kind of it finally converged that I had the money and the thing was on sale, that I was finally able to buy myself, Sean, the Analogue Pocket, which is the very nice new Game Boy hardware emulation machine by the company Analogue, who have also made similar machines in the past for the Super NES and the Genesis and other stuff like that. And they're very well known for this. And I've even talked about this before on the show, like when this was announced, that this was something I was really excited for, because for people who don't know, the Game Boy Color was my first console. Game Boy was my thing growing up. It's why like I gravitate towards the Switch more than like the PlayStation, for instance. Handheld gaming has always been kind of my forte and what I really like. And I was super excited to get this thing as a kind of limited enthusiast collector product. The Analogue Pocket has been in and out of stock for years. It is also fairly expensive. It's $219. I think it finally launched in 2022. I was not able to get it when it came out. And then it's just been a thing where like either it has gone on sale and I didn't have the money, or it would go on sale, I did have the money, and it went out of stock right away. It finally converged, and this week I was able to get the Analogue Pocket, and it came in this week, and it came out in Friday. We're recording this Sunday, so I spent about 2 days playing with it, and I'm absolutely in love with it. It is super cool. For those who don't know what it is, Analogue uses a system called FPGA, which is hardware emulation instead of software emulation. So I'm not going to be able to explain to you all the technical stuff that this does, but basically the idea is the programming inside mimics the actual programming of a Game Boy Color, and a Game Boy Advance, as well as this thing can do Game Gear, Atari Lynx, some other stuff if you get adapters. I never had a Game Gear as a kid, so I don't have any relation to that. But it does all of that in one. So the difference between this and software emulation is this would be much more faithful to the actual, as faithful as you can get through any kind of emulation. And also it is fairly robust in that sense with what they can do with it. The system is sort of, it's built as kind of, I would say, a cross between like a classic Game Boy Color shape and the Game Boy Advance SP. It does not fold, but the way it does like the shoulder buttons is exactly like the Game Boy Advance SP. The form factor is sort of that original Game Boy shape where you've got your D-pad and your face buttons on the front and then the screen above those. The screen is kind of the main selling point of this thing because it is a 3.5-inch LCD that is more pixel dense than basically any screen on Earth. It is 1600 by 1400 and it is an exact 10x integer multiple of the original Game Boy display, which is 160 by 140. So it is like 650 ppi. The iPhone is like 300 to 400. So like it is an extraordinarily like dense like screen that is able to work absolute wonders in displaying the original Game Boy games. You can put in cartridges in the back. You can put in your Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance cartridges natively. Again, if you want to play Game Gear, Atari Lynx, some other portables, I think there's Neo Geo Pocket. They do sell cartridge adapters for that. I do not own any games like that. And one thing I will say right up front, if you are someone interested in like emulating retro handheld games and stuff like that, but you do not own a significant library of cartridges, the Analogue Pocket is not something you should be looking at. If you just want to emulate ROMs, there are other devices that will do that better that are cheaper. There are some cool things you can do with ROMs on this, and I'll talk about that in a second. But if your main thing is, I just want to play a big library of ROMs I got in a handheld form factor, there are a million options for you out there that do not cost $220. One of the main features of the Analogue is that you can play cartridges, and I have a big library. I finally counted, because I have this thing in, I have 40 GBA carts and I have about 20 Game Boy Color carts. So I have a decent sized library of stuff, and that's not even everything I had as a kid, because some pieces I've sold off over the years. Like, I think I've told the story, when Pokemon carts started going crazy, I came in at the peak of that, and I sold Pokemon Emerald for $1,000 on eBay a few years ago. So, yeah, anyway. So I do not have my Pokemon Emerald cart anymore, and I don't think I'll be getting it back because it sells for a lot of money. Yes. Anyway, but that's okay. I still have my Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire carts, or my brother's. I've inherited some of his games as well because he doesn't play with those carts anymore. Anyway, if you want to play with carts, the main experience on this thing, it is incredible. From the main OS, you boot your carts, and then you have a bunch of display options. And the display options are kind of the key to why this thing is so good, because it allows you to either play a super clean image of like what is the underlying kind of art of the video game, what is basically the basic analog OS mode, or they have other modes that emulate the look of the original screens. So for the original Game Boy, they have, I think, 5 modes. So you can run just, again, the basic clean look. Or you can run the original Game Boy DMG, which is the green screen that Game Boys from 1989 originally had, a Game Boy Pocket version of the screen, which is basically black and white, a Game Boy Light version, which is the one from Japan that's like black and white but with kind of a blue glow underneath it. And then, just for fun, my understanding is this is because the guy who does this at Analogue likes taking apart old pinball machines, a Pinball Matrix mode, where it is this like red overlay that kind of looks like the Virtual Boy. It's not intended to be a Virtual Boy thing. It's actually taken from pinball machines, but it's just for fun. That's Game Boy. Game Boy Color you can run with, again, either the normal clean mode or one emulating an original Game Boy Color LCD, or what they call Game Boy Color LCD Plus. I'm not sure what that's supposed to be, but it looks to my eyes what like a Game Boy Color played on the Game Boy Advance SP looks like. So like, which was the best way to play a Game Boy Color. And then for GBA, they have your, again, normal analog mode, or they have a screen emulating the original unlit Game Boy Advance screen, or the GBA SP 101, which was the revision of the SP that had a full backlight, not just the front light, and was the best looking GBA ever.
Can I put this on the unlit GBA screen and then get my little light thing that clips onto it and goes over the top, and then get under the covers and play Link to the Past, and make sure that like my mom doesn't know I'm playing video games in there?
That was my brother's first question was, is there a mode emulating the little light that lights like one corner of the screen and you have to move it around? It doesn't do it that. Obviously, it wants it to look better than that. But yes.
Yeah, but what an insane product to think about in the context of modern technology is here is this like little shit light that kind of lets you see the screen on your device when you're not like holding it directly into the fucking sun, basically.
Yes. But those display modes that I was just talking about, mixed with the pixel density and color accuracy of the screen, are the secret sauce of this device. Because the thing about classic retro games like this, I have become very convinced. I am on team you need scanlines. I think if you are looking at the raw pixel art of these games, sometimes it can look nice and it can be cool to see what was the underlying art of the game without any of the technology kind of laid on top of it. But that doesn't look right. I would compare it very directly to film grain on like celluloid film. Like, you can take a movie and clean off all the grain and present it smooth, but it will look wrong. Faces will look waxy. Clouds will look washed out, especially with like animation. Like, if you look at, speaking of Dragon Ball, Funimation has done their terrible remasters where they degrain Dragon Ball and it looks like it was made in Microsoft Paint because that was animated to have grain on it in its final photography. And so there are things like, the way they draw clouds is expected to have the extra texture of celluloid film to finish out the image. That's very true of pixel art in games like this. Yeah. The problem is, in a lot of software emulation, the scanline stuff just doesn't look great, right? Like, we've all seen the fake scanlines that, like, I think wash out the image too much or aren't particularly convincing or whatever. The magic of the Analogue Pocket is that because of that, and Digital Foundry and some other, there's been a lot of videos about the Analogue Pocket online, but the one I'm thinking about was one I watched from Digital Foundry from when it came out, where they explained that because of that pixel density, they can make it look exactly like an actual Game Boy screen in terms of it's not just scan lines, but those lines had little gaps between the pixels, and those pixels weren't completely evenly lit. So every pixel on the Game Boy screen on the Analogue Pocket is made up of hundreds of pixels that can actually emulate that dynamic lighting, that can emulate the space between pixels, that can emulate, and I've discovered this and it's revelatory on the original Game Boy DMG, the green screen. It can emulate the way, if you ever played that kind of Game Boy, the pixels looked like they were maybe a layer in front of the back of the screen. Like, there's the green part of the screen, and then there's the pixels that are like a little bit in front of it because it kind of did work that way. It had this kind of weird depth to it. And when you look at it that way, it feels like you're seeing these games for the first time again, because you're seeing the art as the artists expected it to be displayed on the display screen, but without all the limitations of the original Game Boy. The screen, not being backlit, it was very blurry because of all the like ghosting that the original Game Boy screen had. Obviously, none of that is here. And so you're getting this gorgeous experience. And I'm someone, because my first Game Boy was the color, I never played Game Boy games in the like original pea green soup Game Boy DMG model. So whenever I've seen software emulations of that, I've just thought it looked bad and I wouldn't understand why anyone would want to play it that way. And that extends up to the current version that is on Nintendo Switch in the Nintendo Switch Online app, where you can play Game Boy games like that. I think it just looks kind of shitty. On here, I'm kind of converted. I think that's the definitive way to play Game Boy games, is on the Analogue Pocket with their emulation of the original DMG screen. You get immediately the logic of the game designers who were making games knowing that's the display it would be seen on. And there's just things come to life. There's like a texture to things. You realize, like, for instance, in Pokemon, I've been playing a lot. I put in Pokemon Red and I've been playing that because that's, like, to me, kind of the definitive original Game Boy game in my mind. And one of the things you realize is there's just a lot of blank space in that game. And I don't think it was intended to be seen as just a solid white screen, which is what it is if you just play it in kind of normal emulation. But when you play it with like the original DMG or even the Game Boy Pocket Black and White, it's not blank space. It's got the texture of a pixel matrix. Like, that was intended to be seen as like, this isn't blank space. This is ground that we're leaving untextured or something like that, right? And there's a lot of stuff like that, or like the specific shading of the tonality of the green shapes on that DMG screen look really dynamic, and seeing it in this light is incredible. So for the original Game Boy, A+, looks amazing. Game Boy Color, same thing. I think their emulation of either the original GBC LCD or the LCD Plus model that they emulate, especially that LCD Plus is what I prefer to play on for color games on this, and it looks perfect. And then for Game Boy Advance, the one that is emulating the GBA SP 101, which is the Game Boy Advance SP I had for years, and in fact, I still used sometimes until recently. Sean, it's still here on my desk. It finally broke. You can see the hinge.
Oh, no.
This was my SP. It broke last year and was part of my impetus for finally, I need to get the Analogue Pocket because this thing is no longer working. But this was a beautiful looking handheld, and the Analogue emulates the look of that almost eerily perfectly. I'm holding it and I'm suddenly 12 years old again. It's just, it just gets it. It gets the color temperature, it gets the scan lines, all of it. And again, so much of it is because of the resolution it has to work with. It's not just kind of emulating that pixel density, it is using its pixel density to really illustrate the scan lines and the subcolors of pixels and all of that stuff in a hyper detail that you're not going to get anywhere else. And so if you're playing with those visual settings, it's by far the best looking presentation of Game Boy games I've ever seen. For Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, all of them absolutely incredible. Game Boy and Color games fill up the 3.5-inch screen entirely. GBA games were in a wider aspect ratio, so those are letterboxed, but not distracting at all to me. It's because also in both forms, the screen is, for Game Boy and Color, it's quite a bit bigger than an original Game Boy. For GBA, even letterboxed, it is still a little bit bigger than an original GBA display. But it is still in that form factor where it feels correct. These are games that don't quite feel right if you blow them up on a TV, right?
Oh, yeah.
They feel best in a handheld format. So this is perfect for those. And it's just incredible to play that way. And of course, you can play all of your cartridges like that. And so that's great. The limitation then becomes, what if you don't have carts, which for some games is tough because a lot of cartridges go for crazy amounts of money now. And if you don't own a copy, you might not be able to. Well, then what do you do about that? And that is where it gets a little stickier, but I've played around with it and there are good solutions. So the basic thing people will tell you online is that the way the Analogue Pocket is built is there's 2 FPGA cores in it, one of which is by the system OS that does all of that cartridge emulation. And then there is an open FPGA core that is open to the community. And this isn't hacking or anything. You're not homebrewing your system. You basically just take your SD card out of the analog, you do some stuff on your computer, and you can load on cores that the community has made on that open FPGA core. And they've made them for Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance, but also all the other handhelds, for NES, for Super NES, for some other systems. And so there are those emulators as well on here. But again, this is hardware emulation. It's all through FPGA, which has its upsides and its downsides, which means that the really good Super NES software emulators out there don't work on this. The community has had to build new FPGA emulators within what the analog gives them. And it is, again, all community work. And some of it's very good, some of it isn't perfect, but you can play around with that. The limitation to that open FPGA emulation is that you can bring as many ROMs as you want, but you can't use the Analogue Pocket's built-in viewing options, all the stuff I was just talking about, because that's on the other FPGA core that is close to the system. So you can't run your GBA ROMs and use the cool GBA SP101 viewing mode until someone in the community reverse engineers that and builds it in, which has not happened yet. It still looks good. It's still good emulation. You can play your ROMs, do your save states, all that stuff. But for me, if I were just wanting to play ROMs, I think there would be better ways to do that. But I did discover a workaround for Game Boy and Game Boy Color games where you can run ROMs as though you are playing cartridges and use the full suite of analog software. And that is, there is a mode on here under Tools that is called GB Studio. It's something built into the analog, and it's intended to allow you to either create or play other people's creations of Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. So someone might make a new Game Boy Color game, but not put it on a cartridge or something because it's 2024, and then you could take it, put it in GB Studio and play it. The community also discovered that if you take ROMs and do a very simple patch to them, you can turn them into the kinds of files GB Studio reads, and then you are just playing your ROMs as though they are cartridges on the Analogue Pocket. This is something, if you get an Analogue Pocket, I would 100% look into. It's extremely easy. The community has made basically a patching tool online where you take your ROMs, you dump them in, they spit them back out to you in the form that is needed, and You put all those on there, and now all your Game Boy and Color games, you don't need the cartridges, but it's played as though they are the carts. You have all the analog viewing options, you have the save states. It's exactly as good as if you had the cart in there, and in some cases even better, because a lot of carts have dead batteries now. These will not. And so I've been playing around with a lot of that, and that's been fun. For GBA, the best option is going to be to have cartridges, although you could also get a flash cart like an EverDrive. And I think probably the definitive way to use the Analogue Pocket, if you don't want to fuck around with carts, is to have all your ROMs in GB Studio and then get an EverDrive for your GBA ROMs and put that in the back. And then you can play whatever you want to your heart's content with the full quality of the Analogue Pocket. So I might invest in an EverDrive at some point, although my GBA cartridge library has most of what I want. There's a couple of games at some point I want to collect, but other than that, I have a lot of what I want to play. So this is perfect for me, and I'm loving it. You know, last night I was playing, the card I have in there right now is the GBA remake of Donkey Kong Country, and I was absolutely loving it. Played through the whole first world of that. It plays great, looks great, sounds great, again, relative to the, how the Game Boy Advance actually sounds. But it's such a cool tool. And it's the kind of thing that it's gotten better in the 2 years since it came out because of that open core and community work on it, and it's going to keep getting better. And it's just an awesome device. Again, I think if you just want to play ROMs, you're more into the software emulation side of things, there are better devices out there for you. If you care about, you have cartridges, you want to play those again, you want to see your old saves, you want to play in the absolute best visual quality that is most faithful to the hardware, this device is incredible. And for me, who loves these games, and there are so many Game Boy and Color and GBA games I adore, or that like I've always wanted to play and never have, this thing is a dream come true. I adore it.
Well, now you can play the Neon Genesis Evangelion Mahjong game in the highest possible quality, because that is the game that everyone needs to, at least the intro, because it is, if you can read Japanese, or at least enough Japanese, it is the best opening to any video game ever. But
I don't have any Japanese ROMs on here yet. I should, because the ROM packs I was pulling from were like North American carts. I should go find that, because that would be hilarious. Yeah, it's really cool. I mean, that's part of it is for the ones I put into GB Studio. I just got these giant, ROM packs and kind of looked at. I kind of pulled out all the games I wanted from it, but I pulled a lot of weird, obscure stuff too. I was like, oh, there's a lot of Toy Story games on the Game Boy Color, or, various other silly ones like, oh, I've never seen what Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 was like on Game Boy Color. That sounds funny. So you can, load all of those on here and experiment. And yeah, it's awesome. I mean, because like some of my favorite JRPGs also, their definitive versions, as far as I'm concerned, were on this system. The Final Fantasy Advance versions are still arguably the best versions of Final Fantasy 1, 2, 4, 5, 6. 3 didn't come out that way. Dragon Quest, the Game Boy Color versions of 1, 2, 3 are really good versions of those. Particularly the color version of 3 is gorgeous. And I put that on here via a ROM and looked at that last night, and it just, oh man, it looks awesome. So there's so much cool stuff to play with on here, and I'm very glad I finally have this thing.
Yeah, that's awesome, because it has been nice that it feels like, while it is, you have to fork out a lot of money in their very specialty kind of devices, to see over the past 5 to 6 years with devices like that, devices like the Mister, these, kind of community-led efforts to create these sort of emulation environments that are trying to replicate more than just we're playing the game and it doesn't glitch out, but trying to think through those things of what displays were these designed for, and how can we try to replicate the ways it was displayed. Because obviously, CRTs are never coming back. Like, that's never going to be a thing again. But those games, this is for like Famicom, Super Famicom, that era, those games were all made to be displayed on CRTs. And the bad kind of software CRT filters that you associate with like the Xbox Live Arcade releases of those kinds of games always kind of sucked. But it's a very interesting kind of thing to me, because I think there is this kind of false memory that everyone now has, because we are like part of the last generation to grow up with CRTs, because that's like all the games I originally played with were all played on the CRTs that we owned, before eventually we got our first plasma TV in like 2004 or 2005. which is what then I played the Xbox 360 on. But I think this thing where now, because of the way that like emulation has worked out and things like that, not just from like the community, but also like developers re-releasing their old games on more modern platforms, there's this like weird false memory of what those games look like. That's not what those games actually looked like when you played them, for us, when you were kids or whenever you played them originally back in the day on the original displays. And so there's like an entire art form of pixel art that exists that is like a product of like this weird sort of offshoot of not really what it was originally designed to look like. And now like modern indie games are built out of that aesthetic that isn't really the aesthetic of what those classic games actually looked like, which I find very fascinating.
One of the cool things you can do on the Analogue Pocket is all those viewing modes I was talking about, you can do through just a shortcut where you hold down the menu button and you go through the D-pad. And so you can go back and forth in an instant, kind of like, going back and forth between the graphics on Halo Anniversary, which was always one of my favorite things to do. And you can go between just the raw emulation versus the actual like viewing mode that replicates an original Game Boy screen. And there are shapes on screen that you'll realize literally are not coherent if you don't have the scan lines. Like, I think you often see this with things like clouds. You often see it with any kind of rain effects or anything. Like, one of my favorite sets of games on original Game Boy is the Game & Watch Gallery titles, which are these games where they took the classic Game & Watch games but packaged them into Game Boy carts and put Mario and Zelda and Nintendo characters in there, and also fleshed them out a little bit as games. And they're a really fun way to realize how cool those original Game & Watch games were. But those have these shapes, like there's the one like octopus with the octopus's tentacles, or you have the oil game where you have to like get the oil out of the castle, and the oil droplets as they come down. It's so reliant, not just on the pixel art, but the space between the black pixels and the green pixels, that when you look at it without those scan lines and the actual correct viewing mode, it doesn't even really look like a water or a liquid droplet, whereas when you look at it with the correct kind of scan line mode, there's a like weight and dimensionality to it that's like physical, and it's really cool to see. I think these games were more graphically advanced than we think now, because we're looking at them without the screens that made them look right.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and it's just a really fascinating thing, and it's nice that it's becoming more possible if you are like an enthusiast to try to experience these games in that way, and it's getting better all the time. It's a cool thing. It makes you wish you could do this with other kinds of media, that it's a lot harder, right? Like it's there's only so much you can do with like other things like, classic anime from the 80s and 90s, whether like our releases are DNR'd and stuff like that. There's also just like the color palettes have become degraded over time because they weren't preserved correctly. And so the colors have shifted and things like that, where it's not always possible, or it's a more complicated process to try to figure out, well, then how do you account for that? And there's not necessarily going to be we can just design a system that can play this video file and automatically do that. Maybe there's some sort of weird AI shit. I doubt that it would actually be good at doing it. But there's something that, because of the way that video games work, that it's data that you are then that is designed to then be displayed in this specific way, that you can do this. You can sort of like cut it off at the pass and fix those problems and then display it in this way. Whereas that's not necessarily something you can do with film.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with film is it is much better understood by the larger world that grain is important and part of the image than I think it is for scan lines in video games. The downside, though, is that if someone puts out a movie, let's say James Cameron, where he has completely obliterated all the detail in his films through AI processes, well, you can't get that back. You can't take his 4K disc of True Lies and run it through a reverse algorithm that puts all of Arnold Schwarzenegger's facial detail back into the image. There's just nothing we can do about it other than finding earlier masters of the film that have lower resolution but are more faithful to how the film was shot. So yes, there's weird upsides and downsides in both directions, but it's fascinating because it is very analogous to, I think, the problem in film of like, how do you present work that was shot or captured on celluloid film and meant to be projected on digital screens, right? And that's a real challenge, and it's something that now with 4K displays we are able to do it better than ever, but not everyone does it right. And it's the same thing with video games.
Yes. But it's getting better all the time, at least in the video game world. Now film has like this whole weird AI shit that they're dealing with that's like they've found new ways to make their movies look like shit. God damn it.
Luckily, so far, it's just Peter Jackson and James Cameron doing that to themselves. Hopefully it will not spread, is all I can say. Luckily, we got groups like the Criterion Collection out there who will let that happen with their cold dead hands. So that's nice. Anyway, so Analogue Pocket, I'm having fun with it. Let me know what Game Boy games I should play. I got so much I want to play on this thing, and it's awesome.
There's that Resident Evil game on Game Boy that's very cool.
I have it on here, yeah.
Yes, there's. I already said it, but I'm just going to say it again, Neon Genesis Evangelion Mahjong. Like, if you haven't played it.
I just downloaded the ROM, Sean.
It is the must-play game of the season.
Yeah. Also,
Dragon
it's
Ball
just
Z
fun.
Legendary Super Warriors. I
have that on here. And I have the carts of all of the Legacy of Goku games, which is awesome. So anyway, yeah. And those are good games. I should play one of those again. Yeah. All right. Sean, you want to talk about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth?
Yes, let's talk about the Final Fantasy VIIs.
All right. So to be clear, neither of us, I know this game is months old at this point, but forgive us, we were playing other 100-hour-long video games, and now we're playing this kind of inexplicably 100-hour-long video game. So I started it like 2 weeks ago. Just so everyone knows, I am 41 hours in as of this morning. I am in Gongaga, Zach's home. That is where I got to. I think I'm on chapter 9. So I'm a decent chunk into the game. Sean, it sounds like you've done the Nibelheim flashback and kind of the very beginning.
Yeah, I started this game 2 days ago.
Okay.
And I've played it for about 4 to 5 hours. I'm in chapter 2. And I found a chocobo. And I unlocked a map.
Yes. So you probably do not have super developed feelings on the game yet, as I'm guessing.
No, I'm still very much in the early goings. Although I did also play the Yuffie DLC ahead of time as well. So I did that, and then I played the beginning of Rebirth.
Yeah, I did that too. So should I just go first because I've played more of this game and I don't know, or should you go first?
Yeah, either way.
Okay. I will go. I have a lot of thoughts on this game. I have some complicated thoughts. Overall, my experience has been very positive. I've been enjoying the hell out of this game. It's extremely fun. You know, my favorite thing about it that I also think might be its Achilles tendon, so I need to play more to like see where my ultimate thoughts will land on it, is that this game kind of embraces a spirit of silly gameplay variety that has been kind of like ironed out of video games over the last 20 years. It very much harkens back to 90s Final Fantasy, but also 90s and early 2000s games of all stripes that were just more willing to, I think, experiment, have weird mini games, have weird gameplay systems that are not at all fully fleshed out, that are kind of janky but are fun to have just because you can have them there. It's the kind of stuff that I think you saw a lot of in the PS1 and PS2 generation that over the PS3 and PS4 kind of disappear from video games as game development gets so big and expensive and you expect these things to be so fleshed out. So, you know, in Final Fantasy, you can climb walls and you can ride chocobos and you get your big car at one point, your buggy, and you get a fucking grappling hook at one point and all this stuff. Are any of those the best version of that system you've ever seen? Fuck no. But it's like all in there along with an absolute metric fuck ton of mini games that like leads to this kind of celebratory variety, variegated atmosphere that I think is very charming and I think captures a side of the original Final Fantasy VII, which did a lot of these things too, that I don't think I saw in Final Fantasy VII Remake, and that you don't see in Final Fantasy games that much overall anyway, which tend to take themselves a lot more seriously now than they did in the 90s. Final Fantasy VII has some very serious stuff in it. It also has Cloud doing some cross-dressing and, you know, your random funny side plots throughout the game and you know, the golden saucer and all this stuff too, right? And so this game leans into some sides of that, and I am enjoying that. You know, along with all the things that Remake already did well, that this game does as well or better, which is the character animation is incredible, the character voicing, and I'm playing this one in Japanese, and of course the FF7 Japanese cast is all legends up and down the line. It's just incredible, and they're better than ever. And so I think it does tremendous work by all the characters, particularly the ones who I think were not fully articulated in the original game. Like, I think the extra personality they've given Red 13 and Yuffie, and I just got Kate Sith. I can't say his name in Irish, I'm sorry. Keshi. That's basically how they say it in Japanese. My understanding is in the English dub, they just called him Kate Sith, which is wrong. But in Japanese, he is Keshi, basically is how they say it. But anyway, so seeing all those characters, they do such a great job with them, and I love all of that. When it comes to the big, like, story sequences, it generally does them very well, like the Nibelheim flashback. The music is outstanding. It's, a giant soundtrack that does a bunch of really cool stuff and goes further afield from the Uematsu score than the first game did. Sometimes in ways that I don't love, sometimes in ways I love very deeply. So it's very cool. I'll talk about the combat later. It's the same as in Remake, but I've approached it differently this time. But I think the thing that holds me back a little bit on this one is that I love the variety. I love that the world is open. I think it solves so many of the problems Remake had. Remake has a lot of complicated systems that you never really get to fully engage with because you are on rails for 40 hours, and it only sets you free at the point in the game where you feel like you need to go rescue Aerith, and so you don't really want to be set free. Rebirth does not have this problem. If anything, it gives you too much freedom, you could argue, but it is about going out and exploring and experiencing the world. That world is very vibrant. It is full of personality. It's full of things to discover. It's very fun to engage in. And if you like the Final Fantasy VII music and characters and setting, it is a really cool world to inhabit. The downside of that, I think, for me so far, is that it does kind of feel like, and I'm borrowing a term that the YouTube video essayist Sean said on Twitter, not you, Sean, yes. Shaun, where he said he felt like a Final Fantasy VII theme park more than it was an actual version of Final Fantasy VII, and I think that's true. I think it feels like going to basically Final Fantasy VII land and getting to hang out with all your friends and doing all the Final Fantasy VII stuff, and that can be very fun. I also think I am 41 hours in, which is that's already a long game. That's the
length of Final Fantasy VII Remake. That's the length of the previous game.
Yes, and very little has happened in the story so far. There have been very few story sequences at all, frankly. It's mostly open world theatrics and stuff. And it does feel thin. And I think it not only feels thin in that sense, but I also think while it gets some themes of FF7 about like going out and experiencing the world and seeing the totality of it, the thing is, because it focuses so much on this kind of maximalist sense of fun in games, and there are mini games for everything, and every city you go to has a million attractions, and over again, like by the time you get to Gold Saucer is not the outlier in this game. It is par for the course of how the entire game works. You do not get, I think, what is very core to the original Final Fantasy VII, which is the sense that you are traveling through a dead or dying planet that desperately needs your help because you are kind of in the middle of the end times. That feeling is just not here. This world is big and vibrant and fully populated. Everyone seems pretty much fine. I think when you get to stuff like Gold Saucer, the economic themes that were there in the original game are basically gone. They are there in theory, but because Gold Saucer is big, vibrant, and everyone there is happy and fun, and Under Gold Saucer is big, vibrant, and hey, it's a prison warden slumlord, but he's fun and he has you do a chocobo race, so what's the problem here? I think a lot of that gets flattened out. And I am already feeling a certain... I find the game very enjoyable to play, and it has a bunch of stuff I love in it. The thought that I am 4/10 of the way through, if this is a 100-hour game, kind of frightens me because I don't feel me having another 60 hours of this in me. Because this, I have played 100-hour games before. There are more of them than ever, but it is still a rare category of game. Yakuza 7, Persona 5 Royal, Persona 3 Reload even. But those are games that have a depth, not just mechanically, but in their narrative and characters and their approach to world that carries you through 100 hours. I don't feel that yet with this game. And I think it does better by Final Fantasy VII in a lot of ways than Remake did. But I also wonder if it's in its largesse, it kind of misses the forest for the trees. The trees are very beautiful and they're very fun, but I don't know if I really get the sense of the larger work of art. And that's kind of where I'm on the fence. But I also want to stress, I'm enjoying my time with the game very much. But the comparison I made the other day on Twitter was, like, I think this is a more fun game than Final Fantasy XVI from last year. I think it is more fun to engage with. I think it is more varied. It is easier to put a bunch of hours into. But I also think it sticks with me less. It's more fun in the way candy is more fun to eat than vegetables are. But you kind of need vegetables, and if you only eat candy, you're going to get sick of it before you hit 100 hours. So that's where I'm at with it.
Yeah, and honestly, even though I'm maybe 1/10 of what you've played, that's kind of similar to the sort of the vibes I'm getting at this early point. And it's kind of like I feel like my feelings on Rebirth and my feelings on the Yuffie DLC are kind of like mixed, because like they're in the sense that they've been mixed together because I played them in right next to each other. And I do think there's just this thing, and it's very similar to the feeling I had with Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1 or whatever of this remake project, of where they are incredibly good at representing the characters from Final Fantasy VII and giving them voice, and like both literally and then in the writing, and animating them and like making them these like very vibrant people that represent those characters from that game that you love so much. And had like big memorable personalities in that game, but were also abstracted because of the way that it was presented for 1997. Here, it's like those characters are really well represented, but everything else feels like it's from a slightly different video game, right? Like all the original characters do not feel like they mix with this cast. And like the most prominent version of that is in the Yuffie DLC, where you have this second set of Avalanche characters that kind of introduce Yuffie into Midgar. And then you have this moment where you're looking at Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse from our Avalanche from original Final Fantasy VII from Remake at a distance, and you're like, why are those Avalanche characters like weird 80s action movie rejects with like red headbands and all that shit? And these people look like they're like background dancers for a K-pop band. Like, what is going on here? And I think like, and when you go to Calm at the beginning of Rebirth, it has the same vibe where it's like, man, the city looks awesome, and like the skyline in they have captured the vibe of that city design from the original game so well. And I think like the layout of it, like all that is awesome. The people that live in that city do not feel like people that are supposed to be living in that city, though, both in like their design, the way they talk, and the way they act. And yeah, even just 4 hours in, I totally get the thing you're saying of the like the tone of the game having been kind of like shaved down a lot, that you don't get that like really thick, oppressive kind of lonely vibe that Final Fantasy VII had, where it just feels like it is us against the world. We're out here like slowly kind of realizing just how fucked up everything is, which is what this whole, I say the middle section of Final Fantasy VII, it's really the beginning section of Final Fantasy VII, because Midgar is less than an hour long in terms of the game. So it feels like the middle section because this is part 2 of a remake trilogy. But really it's the beginning section of Final Fantasy VII, where you're going out and you're exploring and you're realizing there's a lot more happening here than just Shinra. That Shinra is like a symptom of like this bigger fundamental thing that is fucked up in the world, while you're kind of vaguely tracing Sephiroth's trail. And I haven't really gotten that vibe. And I also think there's just something about a fundamental issue with splitting up the games in terms of presenting the plot, where separating out so distinctly. And if you had replayed Remake, or if I had replayed Remake right before Rebirth, maybe I wouldn't feel this as strongly, although I'd have the very end of Remake, which is gobbledygook next to it, so I don't know. But in the original game, right, you have the whole thing where it's like, oh, Sephiroth is here. Oh, crazy, all the shit has happened. And we're getting out of Midgard to chase Sephiroth. We go to Calm, you stop, and then you get the Nibelheim flashback. That's all consecutive stuff. In this, it's 4 years ago, I played a game that ended with Sephiroth showing up in Midgar. Then all this crazy shit happened that's kind of meaningless. And then we left. And then 4 years later, now I'm getting the flashback that tells me who Sephiroth is and why he's important and what his relationship to Cloud is. And that gap makes the like, and what am I doing when I leave Calm? It doesn't give you any sense of like, where are you in the larger plot? Like, in the original game, it's very clear. We're trying to figure out where Sephiroth is. Here, because that flashback is disconnected from the notion of we just saw Sephiroth and he killed the dude and then we're getting out of the city, because that is separated by so much time, the urgency and the structure and the momentum of the plot feels so weird, because it just is like it's been cast completely aimlessly, at least where I am right now. And I think that's one of the main reasons why, because even though in the original game, yes, this section is very kind of meandering, and you kind of end up on all these like weird kind of dead-end trails where you're learning about, oh, what's going on in this town? Oh, we stumble on over here. It is very meandering, but there is still a really clear overall objective of what you're trying to do and where you're trying to get to. You just don't know quite how to get there yet. And I feel like they don't set that up in a way that feels compelling at the beginning of this game. Also because they make the Nibelheim flashback like 3 times as long as it is in the original game. It's a huge section. It's like 2 hours playing through and going and fighting up to get to the reactor and all that stuff. Like, they spend so much more time on it that its relevance in terms of the plot immediately around it feels like it's completely shaved off.
Yeah, and I will just tell you right now, it's the biggest problem with the game I've had so far. When you leave Calm, your nominal thing that you were doing is, I guess we'll go after the dudes in black robes. I am 41 hours in. The nominal notion is we're still going after the dudes in black robes. I know no more about what the dudes in black robes are. They have no more sense of it. The game is, on a macro level, extraordinarily meandering. And to some degree, I think that is justified, because that is also what, as you were saying, that's what the original game does to some degree. It is, we've gone out of Midgar, we were constrained, now we're open. Exploration, I think a lot of that is completely justified, and I think the overall structure I understand. But it is like, I am at a point where, and my brother has played the whole game and he's finished it. And so I've been talking to him and I've been like, when do we get another big story sequence? Because I've been going through a lot, and like, it does some of the big set pieces and they're very entertaining and they're very well done. Like the whole thing in Junon where you go up to the big like military base and you do all that. Mm-hmm. It's extraordinarily elaborate. It's very fun to play. It's very vibrant. But it also, because it was originally a like 20-minute interlude in the original game where nothing happens, nothing actually happens. Like, you don't get out of that and have a bigger understanding of what you do. You get out of it and go, well, I guess we'll go after the guys in black robes again, and you keep going. And there is a certain level where I'm like, it's been 40 hours. I need the plot to take some kind of fundamental turn, and it has never taken a fundamental turn. And, you could say, well, in the original game, it doesn't take a fundamental turn for a while. And I'm like, yes, but the original game was not 3 games, yes, all of dozens of hours of length. And so that is kind of the issue, where there has set in amongst the variety of the game, and there's a lot of gameplay variety in 7 Rebirth. There's probably 40 minigames I've already played in this fucking thing. There's a lot of variety. But there's also a repetitiveness, because the game is, let's go after the guys in black robes. We get to the next place and go, well, we don't really have to look at the guys in black robes. We could just have fun, because this town has a lot of card games to play, and it's got a lot of chocobo races, and then we can go out and we can do all the stuff for Chadley, and you do all of that, and then you kind of get to the next thing, and then you go, man, we really need a break. We should play some more mini games. And it's just consistently like, there's been 7 versions of the scene where Cloud is like, we should do something, and Tifa and Aerith go, you're too much of a hard-ass, Cloud. We should just rest and relax. And like, in the original game, where that happens is at the gold saucer, and it's the first time Tifa and Aerith have said that to him. It's not gold saucer is the 5th city you've been to that is chock full of minigames. This was something that I think gold saucer was where I turned on this game a little bit, because I was enjoying it, and I've enjoyed it since. And I think the gold saucer part is a very good realization of what gold saucer is in terms of gameplay. But it also, instead of it being kind of a fork in the road from what you were doing up to that point, it's another place with a bunch of minigames you do. You do this whole part in Costa del Sol that is if you want to complete it took me 4 or 5 hours to do all the minigames there. And then you go, the next place you go is Golden Saucer, and it's the same thing, just different games. And I think it has this problem of just, it wants to entertain you so much, and it wants to be so maximalist. I'm not sure it even understands if it is telling a story at all.
Yeah, and I think for me, there was also this moment of playing the Nibelheim flashback, which is, the Nibelheim stuff is one of, if not my favorite part of the whole story of Final Fantasy VII. But I had this moment where you get to the end of that flashback and I realized, oh, wait, the other side of this is not even going to be in this fucking game.
Yes.
It's going to be 3 to 4 years from now that you actually get the payoff for the Nibelheim flashback, which is the thing that makes it so cool.
Yes.
And of course, by the time you get to that point, it's already will have been kind of like turned into something so weird because they've got all this weird extra Zax stuff that I don't think, my assumption is just going to amount to nothing. Like I do not know what happens at the end of this game. I'm 4 hours into this game. My thesis, and this is what I thought before this game came out, it's what I think now that I've played the first 4 hours, I do not think any of the new shit they are sprinkling on top is going to lead to anything significantly different. I think this game is going to end wherever they choose to end, and it's going to end with the status quo is going to be the same fundamentally that the status quo was in the original game. So it's like, so when I'm saying like I don't like the Zack stuff they're doing and I don't like the Zack stuff they're doing, it's not because I think they're changing anything in the story, because I don't think it's going to do that. But I think it's like, it just adds junk information into a story that doesn't need that junk information. And so when you have this weird opening scene that means nothing of Zack's in the parallel world or whatever the fuck it is, and he's in Midgar and whatever, it's a pointless scene. It's there to be like, oh, are they going to do something crazy? They're not going to do something crazy. This is the same shit that Remake did, and Remake didn't actually do anything crazy. It's like, it ends up muddling the stuff that's actually important, and it's like, I don't know what's the point of putting in all this weird Zack stuff now, when in the next game is when you're going to have the reveal where Cloud realizes that it was not him that he was thinking of in that flashback. When it's just like, I just don't understand the point of trying to throw in all this information in a story that doesn't need or ask for it.
Yeah. So I will say where I'm at, the Zack stuff comes up maybe once per chapter. You get another scene with him, and I know kind of nothing more than you do from my point. It's just more of, he is in a parallel world where kind of the reverse happened from in our world. So he is alive, Cloud is conked out. Barrett and Tifa got killed, Aerith is with him. Like, that kind of stuff is what it's conveying. Where it's going to go, I don't know. This game does do a lot more of the Tetsuya Nomura things are changing bullshit than Remake did, but it does it too, I think, the same kind of, I'm not sure where it's going. But I think in this game it's even heavier because of Zack, because of some of the other ways they frame things. Rebirth is extra clear that, like, this is a sequel. You are expected to have played FF7. You are expected to have played Crisis Core. You definitely need to have played Crisis Core for Rebirth. There are parts of it that just do not make sense. Like, you need to know who Zack is and what his significance is, or all of that is gibberish. And, like, if you hadn't played Crisis Core, a lot of that is going to be lost on you. To the point that there are, like, musical cues from Crisis Core they use at certain moments for specific uses. And I can get on board with some of that, because Crisis Core is my favorite Final Fantasy game. One of my favorite games ever. But, like, I think it's the same problem you and I had with Remake, and I think we're always going to have with this, which is that this project is just neither fish nor fowl. It is neither the sort of Remake people imagined for a long time, where here is the new version of FF7 that you could give to someone who didn't play the original, doesn't like retro games, couldn't get into it, but here it is now with voice acting and cinematics and all of that stuff, right? This is not that. You cannot tell someone who has not played Final Fantasy VII to go play Remake and Rebirth. It will be gibberish to them. It is not that kind of remake. But it is also not fully a new thing that is kind of a alternate world sequel to FF7, because it does stick to all of the beats of the original, just done at, Peter Jackson Hobbit trilogy speeds, right?
That's offensive to the Peter Jackson Hobbit trilogy.
It is.
Come on.
Yes.
Like, you're 40 hours into the second game. You've played over 70 hours of the Final Fantasy VII Remake project.
I've played over 70 hours of the Final Fantasy VII Remake project, and Sean, I looked this up on Wikipedia. I am still not out of the second paragraph of the Wikipedia plot summary of FF7. Like, when you look at what, like, the actual plot of this overall thing is, at the point I'm at, 70 hours into this thing, they've barely told any of the story of Final Fantasy VII. And I think it's because the actual purpose of Remake and Rebirth is to play with the toy box of Final Fantasy VII. Mm-hmm. It is to play with all the characters. It is to play with the aesthetics. It's to play with the music. It's to play with all of Tetsuya Nomura's various obsessions. it really is not to faithfully retell FF7, or I think to really meaningfully interrogate FF7. I saw all the think pieces 4 years ago about how, Final Fantasy VII Remake is smart because it's really about the idea of remaking something and the question. And I said, no, it's not. It's not.
A mystery
it
box.
asks.
It's a J.J. Abrams style mystery box put onto the plot of Final Fantasy VII. That's all that it is.
Yes. And I think I've seen smart people make this point, and I can tell that they are wrong because they will say that and they won't have a follow-up. They won't say, well, if you were to ask, well, what does it say about remaking something? Because that is an interesting theme, and it does broach that topic, but what does it actually say about it? And it says nothing because it never gets to any point about it. Rebirth is very much the same way. So, there's a lot of fun to be had. I am just finding myself at the point where what I'm itching to do is to go play Crisis Core or original PS1 FF7 again because I want to see the it's making me nostalgic for all the things I love about FF7, but this game is never going to actually give me that stuff because it's not fully going to articulate the story of FF7. Or if it does, it's going to be very, very glacial, and it's going to have a lot of Tetsuya Nomura mystery box bullshit on top of it. So it's a frustrating game to talk about because even though I think it does a lot of things extraordinarily well, the totality of it is fairly empty.
Yeah, and it is because I am having fun with it. I do want to stress that. And I think it is hard to overstate how important it is that this game is that you leave calm and you're not in a fucking corridor anymore because it's Remake was just such a claustrophobic feeling game.
The Yuffie DLC I had trouble finishing because it's just corridors. Yes. And it frustrated me.
And it's man, that is such a kind of bomb. As soon as you get out of there, I'm holy shit. And again, I love these characters and they do such a good job at bringing them to life. I mean, that is the reason to play the Yuffie DLC is just being able to have Yuffie, and then I know, Jonathan, I'm sure you must have loved this, the incredibly long experimental jazz piece that is the entire ending section of the first chapter of the game that's an hour long.
Half an hour. It's crazy.
It's crazy. That's that shit's great, and then Yuffie is amazing. Everything else in it is whatever. And then even that DLC does the shit at the end where you have this moment with Yuffie and they kind of end it this part that feels like they've gotten the essence of that character, which is that her sort of childishness is kind of a put on to a certain point because she's a kid who's living in a dying world, knows that it's a dying world. She, her country is brought to the point of destruction when she was a child because Shinra attacked them. And so there's this moment when she comes out at the end of that DLC and she sees Sector 7 falling from the events of the original game. And she's sort of faced with that and that man, this whole I'm the world's best material hunter, Yuffie-chan, that whole thing is kind of a put on because she knows that this world is shit. And then she gets out into the desert. And there's this moment where she points her hand up to the sky and she says, I'm done with this. Isn't there someone here who's going to join my party? Or something like that. And then you get some credits and then it fades in. And you get this long, pointless sequence of watching the cast from Final Fantasy VII, Cloud and them, going and getting on hitchhiking onto a truck to go to Calm. And then you get this scene with Zax coming into Midgar and the church where Aerith is, and it's just completely meaningless. I'm why are these scenes here? What is the point of this? Because I thought when they cut to Cloud and all of them, I was oh, great. The ending of this will be great. It'll show Yuffie, and she'll see them off in the distance and be aha, I smell some materia, and it will cut to black because she goes and she steals materia. Or what I would really do is then the last boss fight is you just beating the shit out of Cloud and taking all of his materia and running away. And that would be a great way to end that DLC. But no, they end the DLC with these weird scenes that feel like they're teasing the next game, which just feels weird when it's it's a remake of a thing of just I don't know, having these scenes that tease what is Cloud up to. It's they're going to the next city. I don't know. And then the scene with Zax, that it means nothing. And I don't need it and I don't want it. The Zax is dead and I'm good with him being dead because that game was amazing. We don't need to do some weird, what if he was in a parallel universe where Zax was still alive? I don't need or want that. I want you guys to tell an interesting version of this story for Final Fantasy VII, reflecting on it all these years later. And I feel like they could make that game because so much of the stuff in here feels like when it is doing that stuff, it's really interesting with what they're doing with the character writing specifically. It's just couched in something that is not thinking about its implications or its relationship to the larger fundamental storyline that those characters are there to help tell. And that's the thing that's really frustrating. That's giving me the same thing you're just talking about, Jonathan, of playing this first 4 hours of this game is just desperately making me want to just replay the original Final Fantasy VII because I want to get to the other half of that Nibelheim flashback. I want to get to the part where like all Cloud has all of his bullshit called on him, and then him and his and Tifa's relationship radically changes. Like what Aerith's ultimate role is in the plot, seeing like all these characters sort of brought to task and having to like, you know, face the ending of this game. Like all that stuff is so good, and the thought that I'll have to wait 3 to 4 years to even see their version of the payoff for any of this stuff, it is like a little bit hard to take.
I mean, because I've asked my brother to fill me in on some details as he's further along, because the further I've gotten in, they tease way more than original FF7 did that Cloud is not who he says he is. Like that's, and it's communicated in such a way that I think the game clearly expects the audience to know that twist. The same way that Remake does all of that foreshadowing of Aerith's death that the original game didn't do, because it knows everyone on Earth knows Aerith dies in FF7, right? And so I asked Thomas, I'm like, did they move up the second half of the Nibelheim flashback to this game? Because it feels like this is building to the end of Rebirth being Cloud realizing the truth, because Zack is here, because the stress they did on the Nibelheim flashback, because there's a lot more discussion of Cloud's memories. And he said, no, they do a lot of talk about it, but no, the game ends and Cloud has not learned that. And it feels weird. It feels extremely weird to have a game where you do the Nibelheim flashback, and at the end of that game, you have not revealed why that flashback is important.
Yeah, and that's the exact thing I'm talking about. Of like, I think like the way they've gone about this remake trilogy is kind of cowardly because they're too afraid of changing the status quo. So it's like they will throw on this weird extra spice, to like make you think, oh, what's really going on here? But at the end of the day, it's just following the storyline of Final Fantasy VII. But because it's trying to throw in all this extra spice, it's not really thinking about how do we tell that storyline in the best possible way. And it's frustrating because I like that storyline and I like a lot of what's going on in this game, and I'm going to keep playing it. But it is just like, it feels really annoying that they're not fully, I think, understanding what is actually good about Final Fantasy VII, really, or what makes Final Fantasy VII as good as it is. It's maybe a better way to put it. In the way that Crisis Core did. Like, Crisis Core was a game that understood underneath it all, like, what is the beating heart of Final Fantasy VII that makes it something that, like, is so compelling and speaks to people in this way. And the way they told the Zack, Cloud, Sephiroth story in Crisis Core so captures that. Is there some weird stuff in Crisis Core with Genesis that I think, like, is not always as good as it could be? Yes, like, Crisis Core is not a perfect game, but it is a game that understands better the fundamental appeal and the ideas that these stories are exploring than so far what the remake trilogy is telling me.
I agree with that. But I do want to back up and just say, I think when I can pull myself out of that macro feeling, this game is moment to moment extremely fun to play. It looks great, it plays great. I do enjoy a lot of the stupid mini games, and I enjoy that PS1, PS2 era sensibility of kind of throwing shit at the wall to see what sticks. It's got the card game Queen's Blood. I love Queen's Blood. Yep. I'm obsessed with Queen's Blood. It fucking rocks. It's still there was a very funny moment where you get to the town that in North Coral where Barrett is from, and you get the whole Barrett flashback and stuff. But as you're going into the town, everyone in the town is mad at Barrett, and you're like, and in the mystery is, oh, what did Barrett do? And you're going to get to all of that. But I, as Cloud, immediately saw a Queen's Blood player over here, and I just bolted from the party to go play card games. And it is very funny to imagine Cloud being like, yeah, Barrett, I don't really care about your bullshit. I got cards to play over here, and I do enjoy doing that. So the card game, I love that. Again, a lot of the stupid, silly games they have along the way, I like them. And even when I don't like them, I kind of like them in the kind of endearing, in the same way Final Fantasy VII has a lot of bad mini games, the original one, right?
Yes,
and there is something endearing about that. So anyway, you have all of that. I enjoy exploring the world. I think it strikes a pretty decent balance between being an Ubisoft-style checklist and being something where the checklist exists for you to encourage you to go explore the world and see stuff, and there's variety, and all of that is fun. So I'm enjoying all of that. And then there's the question of the combat, because people who've listened to this podcast might remember I really did not like the combat system in Final Fantasy VII Remake, and it really is part of what soured me on that game. The combat system is identical in Rebirth, other than you have new characters to play as and some new synergy abilities which are built out from what was in the Yuffie DLC. And I have learned to embrace it. I don't love this combat system yet. I think it is one of the messiest and possibly the most complicated combat system in all of Final Fantasy. I'll justify that statement in a little bit, but I think I'm right. I think what turned me on it, though, is I played the Yuffie DLC, and I almost didn't finish it because I found the combat so obnoxious. But I did push myself through it, and then I said, okay, the only way I'm going to play Rebirth is if I learn to love this or endure this combat system. So what I did is I started Remake again, and I said, I remember not thinking this was good, but let me look at this classic option they have again. And I played the first half hour of Remake again with that classic option on. And the way it works in Remake, and it's pretty much the same in Rebirth, is you have easy or normal combat, and then you have easy or normal with classic mode turned on. The classic mode thing I actually think is a good tool to have. It is a misnomer, though. It in no way recreates the experience of classic FF7 with its turn-based combat. That's not what it does at all. What the classic mode does is it basically has your characters auto-battle, the one you're controlling, the same way the people who are in your party but you're not controlling do. So they will automatically block, they will automatically attack, and they will automatically maneuver around the battlefield, which frees you up to focus on commands. But crucially, at any point, you just start hitting buttons, you are in command. So you can start fighting, you can start moving around, you can do all of that, and then if you take your hands off the thumbsticks, the AI takes over again. And this actually opened up the combat for me in a really important way, because I realized the problem I had with the combat, and to some degree still do, is that it is so complicated. You have 3 characters, all of whom have different abilities, all of whom have separate ATB meters, all of whom have separate spells and material and all this stuff. And you are on a 3D battlefield where you have to dynamically position yourself, and you have to attack, and you have to guard, and you have to dodge. And it was just frying my brain. That's what it did in Rebirth, or in Remake. It was doing it to me here. So what the classic thing does for me is it just takes just a little bit of that tension off, and it makes it more easy to engage with. And this is actually a kind of combat system that exists in other games. If you play it with Classic on, this is kind of a funny reference, but I had to play some of this game for my dissertation. It's similar to the Sword Art Online games like Hollow Fragment, where what that is it's you don't actually control Kirito. He's running around the battlefield fighting. You're putting in commands to determine kind of his combat style, but you're not directly swinging the sword. That's what classic mode is a little bit more like, and there are some different games and action games and MMOs that do stuff like that. So it's not completely out of the realm of possibility. But anyway, that has made me understand and embrace the combat system more. And I am enjoying it on that level. So I think if you, like me, ever felt overwhelmed by the combat system, I actually think the classic mode is a good tool to let you engage with it fully. You can still do everything, but you don't have to worry as much about like what it does for me is when I go into combat, I lift my thumbs off the thumbsticks. I am working completely with the D-pad and the buttons, and that just, I cannot tell you how much more manageable that makes it, because I really do think this is one of the most complicated gameplay systems I've ever seen in a game. You have, I think where I'm at, you have like 7 or 8 party members. They all have their own upgrade trees. They all have their own spells. You have a billion materia. They all have different weapons. They all have different combat abilities. They have different transformations. And in combat, you have 3 of them all going at once. It is incredibly dense. It's kind of funny because FF7 was part of why FF7 has the combat system it has, was it was an attempt to simplify the combat for new players who they wanted to court on the PlayStation. That's why they did materia. That's why they did the version of ATB they did. That's why it only has 3 characters. And like the flip side of that in Remake is, I think from everything I've played, and I've even played like 20, 30 hours of 14, this is a ridiculously complicated battle system.
Yeah, I would think I would basically agree. I think I've always liked the combat in this more than you did in Remake, and I'm not playing with the classic mode, but I definitely see the appeal of it. Because yes, I think it's like overly complicated is what it feels like, where by trying to mash up the more turn-based stuff with this more action-y stuff, you end up with a combat system that's got so much fluff on it of like there's just a lot of stuff that like you could do, but do you really need or want to do it? And I find like I typically enjoy the combat the most when I just say like, fuck it. And I switch over to Tifa and I just punch the shit out of stuff. Because that's all you really need to do, other than occasionally there's the enemy where, okay, now I need to use like a spell to stagger them. But for the normal combat stuff, Tifa I think feels by far the best because she is the most responsive character. So I think for me, the thing I dislike the combat. I don't like how sort of like excessive the combat is in that way of like you have too many characters being able to do too many things, and a lot of it doesn't feel like clear or well defined in a gameplay sense of why you would want to do those things. And so a lot of the combat feels like I vaguely learn what to do or like what they all are, and then ultimately decide, well, I just don't really need to bother with that, and I'm never going to do it again, basically, because I don't need it, and it just is too much sort of like mental load to try to decide if I want to use those attacks. Whatever, you don't need it. Like the combat's not hard. It's just a lot to think about at any given time. For me, the thing I don't like about the combat, and this is like exacerbated in the Yuffie one because you don't have other party members as well, so the Yuffie one just feels like thin. I mean, you have Sonnen, but you can't take control of him. He's like a very thin party member. The thing that was rough, I think, is the defense side of the game. I do not like how it feels. I think it's part of the problem of trying to do this. It's kind of an action game. It's kind of a turn-based game. Is that taking damage in a turn-based game is an inevitability, right? There's nothing you can do to avoid it. Taking damage is a thing that you know is going to happen. And so the strategy in a turn-based game is about how do you mitigate the damage that is being dealt to you? Whereas in an action game, typically damage being taken is a thing that happens because you fucked up, right? Any damage being taken is a thing that could have been avoided if you played better. And going back to the roots of action games where oftentimes classic action games in like the 80s, you die if you get hit. Like it's a one hit and then you are gone, right? You're playing Contra, you get hit by a bullet in that game, you fucking explode and you're dead. And you use up another life, and like do better, don't get hit next time, scrub, right? Like that's how those games were designed. And
even Mario, you hit by the Goomba and you're gone, right?
Yeah. And modern action games are, more complicated than that, and there's more variety in terms of how you deal with blocking versus parrying versus dodging and all that kind of stuff. But fundamentally, if I'm playing like a Dark Souls game or something like that, if I've taken a big chunk of damage, unless I'm going for like a different kind of armored build, or maybe you're sort of trying to design a little bit around that, but typically it's like, oh, well, I fucked up my block or I fucked up my roll, and I should have done that better, and I wouldn't have taken damage. And the thing with Final Fantasy VII Remake is it feels like the damage stuff is an inevitability. Like, it really fundamentally, it is kind of impossible to avoid the damage at certain points, or it's not reasonable to try to avoid it. And so and that feels bad to me. It's like, I know it and I can play the combat system, and it's like, and I can do it well. I'm not like struggling with it or dying a lot or anything like that. It just feels bad to me that like the defense feels so kind of passive, and like I just don't like that part of the game. I don't like how you like the blocking and the dodging, how that feels or works. And it's a thing that's making me just kind of wish the combat was Final Fantasy 16. Like, it's just like, let me like actually do combat or go harder on the turn-based thing. And that's the thing we talked about before. Like, my feeling on the combat has not fundamentally changed playing the Yuffie DLC in this. It's just sort of reminded me, right? Yeah, like it's still fun. I still enjoy it. Like, I think it like the attacks feel good and the effects and all that stuff can feel good. And some of the strategy on the harder enemies can be entertaining to sort of figure out and execute. But there are parts of the combat that just feel mushy in a way that I'm not a big fan of.
I have gotten to a point where I do consistently enjoy it. I very rarely engage with the combat in this game and don't have at least a good time. I have fun with it. Part of that for me, though, was actively deciding to ignore parts of the combat, right? Yeah. Like, because the big thing for me, why Classic helps, and I should have said this earlier, is it's because Remake has a dodge roll that you shouldn't fucking use.
Yes.
It has this roll that is on the Dark Souls roll button, but if you are doing that, you're fucking up because you can't actually really roll away from the damage. Blocks are way more important, but the block doesn't really feel natural either. So that is what fucks me up when I'm directly controlling the characters, is I just... Even if I'm telling myself, don't roll, don't roll, don't roll, my instincts from years of playing PlayStation action games is that when the guy's barreling at me, I should press circle to dodge, and it's a move in here that you shouldn't actually use. So, like, that is what made Classic better for me, is it just took that out of the equation. I'm not playing with that anymore. And then the other thing for me was realizing this game is almost, you could compare it to like a fighting game or something, and that you just have to accept, I'm not going to master everybody in the roster. I need to just focus on the ones that kind of matter to me. So my party is Cloud, Yuffie, and Barrett, and those are the ones I mainly play with, and I really enjoy them, and I've learned their kind of intricacies, and I can have fun with them. I also sometimes, Tifa would be the next one that I will put in sometimes, and I like her. Aerith, I cannot figure out. It's been 2 games. I don't know how you're supposed to play Aerith. It's complete gibberish to me, which is weird because Aerith was the best unit in the original game. She's a fucking tank in that original game. I don't know what you're supposed to do with her here. It's completely impenetrable to me. I did a whole mini game with her the other night where you have to fight these Cactuar as Aerith. I couldn't figure out what they wanted me to do. It's gibberish. Kate Sith seems pretty cool. I like some of his stuff, but mostly I'm fine with my other players. And that's kind of where I'm at with it. So when I've done all of that stuff, I can have some good fun with it. But it is even in like, you know, easy fights, I'm always feeling like, man, there's like whole corners of this combat system that I'm not engaging with because I either don't need to or I forget to, like the synergy moves. I don't even fully understand how that all works, and I'm 40 hours into the game.
I just did the tutorial on that, and it was very frustrating because so the tutorial, you know, you have you hold down block, and then you can use, which is a thing that like I knew it. I technically unlocked that in the Yuffie DLC, but I was like, I have no idea what the fuck. I hadn't realized in the Yuffie DLC that it didn't take up an ATB meter, and that was really confusing to me because they don't tutorialize it really in that DLC. And it wasn't until the end of that game that I was like, oh, I can just do this whenever. Okay, that it kind of makes more sense, but it's weird. Here they at least tutorialize it. But the thing that I haven't done yet, and again, I'm only 4 hours in, but in the tutorial is very poorly designed because you do one fight and it tutorializes, oh, you hold down R1 and then you press the face buttons that are assigned to these synergy moves that you unlock in your, you know, grimoire or whatever the fuck. Because now the skill tree is not on the weapon anymore. The weapons have like a simplified skill tree, I guess.
This took me forever, and I finally asked my brother, "Am I missing something here?" All that is on the weapons is they unlock basically weapon-specific materia that you can slot in.
Yeah, they're like
but
perks.
there is no skill tree. Yeah, it's just perks.
Yes.
The skill tree is all in the grimoire thing.
Yes, which now you can't access whenever you want. You have to go to a weird grimoire vending machine that does. Like, yes. I don't understand that. I thought the level up system on the weapons was fine before. I'm not entirely sure.
Oh no, it was fucking awful. This is bad too. It's just incomprehensible in Remake. I hated that.
I don't know. It didn't bother me like there. This feels like weird. I just don't. I feel like they. This is a Final Fantasy problem. They overcomplicate the leveling process too much. But regardless, they've been
doing that for 40 years.
Yes, you unlock these synergy moves. The problem with the tutorial is you get to round 2 of the tutorial and it tells you, oh, this is how you do the synergy moves. But you kill the enemies before you can charge up the synergy move. So I was like, I just murdered them immediately. Like, wait, well, how do you actually do it? Because I never got the opportunity to actually use the like ones that you have to like build up the meter or whatever to do.
Yes. There's synergy moves that you do from R1 that are little ones you can do whenever. And then you have your little gauge. And I don't even really know how the gauge builds up. I just know it does. And then that is something you have to go into the menu to activate the synergy move. And that is like a powerful non-ATB move. It's kind of like a limit break with 2 people.
And the tutorial implied that you level up that meter by using the regular synergy abilities on the R1 thing. But because it had this thing where it's like, oh, but as you do it with one attack, then it like doesn't charge up as much. So it's like, mix it up as you play. I'm like, I think I understand what you're saying, but then I killed all the enemies. Like, well,
Yes.
That's not how tutorial. There's a reason why when you play the Yakuza games and you do a combat tutorial that they make the enemy invincible until you do the thing that the tutorial's telling you to do. So you can just punch them around a little bit until you're like, oh, this is how you do this grab move. This is how you do this heat attack. I just found it incredibly funny that I just absolutely smoked the enemy immediately. I'm like, oh, well, okay, I guess eventually I'll fight something that's strong enough that eventually I will be able to use the synergy ability, but I haven't fought anything like that yet.
I mean, that's the other thing, is that 90% of the combat you'll do in this game is so easy, you don't need to know almost any of the actual combat system. And I think it's a weird, because I don't know how I feel about that. Sometimes I'm like, I'm glad they don't overdo it. Sometimes I'm like, they have a lot of pieces here that you don't ever actually have to use because the game isn't that hard. I don't know. It's a weird thing. One thing I will say for the combat in this game, though, is that whatever you feel about it, it is such a smaller percentage of the overall tapestry of what you do in the game. Whereas in Remake, it was most of what you did was just run down corridors and do combat. So if you didn't like the combat, you know, you're going to be pretty miserable in the 7th time Cloud falls down a hole so that we can delay the plot so that he has to, you know, run through a dungeon. In this game, combat is one small part of a suite that includes walking and running and driving and doing chocobo stuff and doing mini games and doing exploration. And so the balance is so much better that, like, whatever the strengths or weaknesses of the combat are in general, I think the balance is much more correct. And so whether I love it or not, it's a smaller part of the game, and that makes it better.
Yeah. And again, like, I fundamentally like the combat. I just think it's a flawed system, and that tutorial did crack me up because it's like, I wanted to do the move. I just literally couldn't because I tried it again and I still killed the enemy too quick. So I'm like, well, okay.
I'll just tell you right now, Sean, I found that I could not reliably even build the gauge up until like 10, 20 hours into the game. Like, those were not something I engaged with for a long time because it was just, I never had the opportunity in combat.
Yes. I mean, most of the combat I've done so far, again, I'm only 4 hours in, but I've mostly rolled as Cloud and then held down square, which makes you do like an aerial attack on an enemy. And then I did the braver move because if you're in the air, it does like double damage and you just fucking kill everything. So that's gotten me through most of the early sections of this game. I'm waiting for something that doesn't just kill immediately.
Yes. Here's a question. What graphics mode did you choose?
The resolution mode, because I've gotten used to, like, for a game like this where it, like, the inputs are mushy even if it's on high frame rate, which is what I kind of did with the Yuffie DLC. I'm like, the problem with the problem with the combat is not the frame rate with this, and I just didn't. I thought it looked with the on the resolution mode, or sorry, on the frame rate mode, and so I'm fine with playing it at 30 frames. I got used to it very quickly.
So I'm playing on the frame rate mode, and I agree, it looks pretty soft. A lot of people have talked about this. You can see the analysis on Digital Foundry or wherever you look for this stuff, and it is soft. My problem with the 30 FPS mode, and I have tried to switch over to it several times, it has no universal, like, motion blur solution, so it's a particularly choppy 30 FPS. Like, I normally do not have this problem. I played FF16 at 30, no problem. Even, this was kind of funny, it was on sale in the eShop for like $5, so I finally picked it up because I was curious. I got Doom Eternal on Switch because I have every other Doom game on Switch, and I was like, I want to see it, and I'm just fascinated by those, like, impossible Switch ports. And the Doom Eternal one is probably the most impressive I've seen because it's just Doom Eternal. I mean, it looks a lot softer and it runs at 30 FPS, but I will say one thing I immediately noticed is it's got the motion blur dialed in so perfectly that it feels pretty smooth. You notice it's different, that it's 30, but it feels very good to play. And I think in part because I had just played a couple levels like that, the 30 FPS in this game feels really choppy to me, to a point where, like, I'm playing it and I don't usually get motion sick. It made me feel a little, like, queasy. So I have stayed, and I've tried several times, but I have stayed on the frame rate because I don't know why. And it's just weird. I know they're all different teams, but I'm like, ask the FF16 guys what they did. The 30 FPS felt fucking fine there. It was perfect. And it just feels choppy to me. I don't know what else to say. Yeah, My brother felt the same way, I will say. So it's not just me.
I think the thing is that the game, it's the camera movement. So if, like, you're moving the camera, like, that's where it looks really bad.
Yes.
And, like, so I just don't move the camera much. This is, like, a thing in a lot of Japanese games, I feel, because partially, like, like FPSs and stuff like that traditionally never took on in Japan. So like the right stick as a constantly moving the camera thing is just not a thing that a lot of Japanese players do. And so I think there are a lot of Japanese games that are kind of designed thinking you're not really moving the camera that much while you're playing. And if you kind of get used to playing that way, it doesn't become a problem. But yes, if you're swiveling the camera around a lot, I think it absolutely could get you motion sick because it is choppy because there's no motion.
Then that's what it is. Yeah. And I move the camera, and I'm sorry, I'm 31. I'm not going to rewire my brain that way. I move this camera a lot. So, and I think it looks fine. I think it's I will say it's kind of funny. The last time we recorded, Sean, we had to talk about the PS5 Pro, and I said I had not yet played a game that made me feel the need for that. And I think it was that night I started Rebirth, and I'm like, this is the first one where I kind of see the point because the frame rate mode is really soft. Now, to be fair, could they probably get better performance out of the existing PS5 on the graphics? Yes, and I've seen because it's an Unreal Engine 4 game that's based on all the tech from FF7 Remake. So there's a bunch of things going on here, but if the image quality were better, I would say 60 FPS, no doubt, because it's a very smooth 60 FPS. To me, the trade-off is worth it. I can understand. I mean, it's one of those ones where I'm glad the option exists.
Yes. Because I just the really bad image quality in a lot of PS5 games on the 60 FPS modes has just kind of come to bother me. And like I can get used to the 30 FPS pretty easily, and the game looks really nice. Like the character models in particular look so good. That it just feels a shame to have them kind of feel a little smeared up with Vaseline, which is kind of what the 60 FPS mode looks relatively. But yes, it's like neither option is perfect because of the bad motion blur. Because I got used to it because I kind of have trained my brain to play some of these kinds of games that way, where I just don't move the camera that much. But that's not a thing that you should have to do.
Yes.
It should be fine to move the camera and have good motion blur, and it doesn't make you feel bad.
Yeah, and again, it is something specific to this game because we've had to make this choice more and more as the generation has gone on, and usually I can make the adjustment. Guardians of the Galaxy was another one I did that way, but this is one where I decided the image quality bothered me less than the 30 FPS. Your mileage may vary.
Yes, it's neither mode is perfect.
Anything else to say about FF7 Rebirth based on neither of us are, in the grand scheme of things, that far in the game?
But yeah, I'm very much not. I mean, I'm still, like, when I unlocked the tower and I, was like, okay, I've got some, I ran around and did some things. I did the tutorial missions. Like, the gameplay side of it started to click for me more. So it's like, I am excited to play the game. I feel like I am in kind of a mood for a more checklisty open world thing, because Yakuza is a very long game, but it's not really like that.
No.
So I am excited to kind of get into the gameplay side of the thing, and I want to see more of the characters, but I definitely am, not particularly excited with the plot side of things. I'm morbidly curious about, what do they do at certain moments? Like, where do they try to put their weird spice in? Like, how does that affect things, or how does it not affect things? Like, I'm curious about that stuff to a certain extent, but that's not why I want to keep playing the game.
Yeah. There's a lot of good stuff as you go along, I will say. When you get to, the Golden Saucer, the Dio character, the guy who runs the Golden Saucer, is voiced by Koichi Yamadera. That's pretty awesome. That's great. When you get to Barrett's flashback, Dine, the guy who is Marlene's biological father, he's voiced by Kenjiro Tsuda, Kaiba from Yu-Gi-Oh!
Okay.
There's just there's a bunch of A-listers who are just in small parts throughout the game like that. So there's a lot to enjoy there.
Yeah, and I'm also really excited to get Yuffie because I thought the way they did that character in the DLC was phenomenal, and I love Yuffie.
She's great. She's the highlight of this game. Her combat is the most fun. It's great. So she rocks. Anyway, a lot of, again, it's a fun game. If you want to have kind of the theme park experience of Final Fantasy VII, that is fun. I really enjoyed the Costa del Sol section where you're going around on your weird little, you have a scooter that you go through town on, and you can get bikinis and swimsuits for all the boys and girls in your team, and you play carnival games and all that. And I'm like, does any of this really add to my understanding of the themes of Final Fantasy VII? No. But is it a fun, weird kind of carnival version of this world that I love? Yes, and I can understand enjoying it on that level because it is enjoyable. So there you go.
And I laughed really hard in the Nibelheim flashback where they have Cloud thinking of himself as Zax doing the terrible, awful, not how you're supposed to do squats where he swings his arm at the bottom, and that they have been doing it like that for like 20 years in these Final Fantasy things, and still nobody on the Final Fantasy team knows how to actually do a squat, and I'm glad that that is still the case. So,
yes,
there's still a lot of fun to be had in Final Fantasy VII.
Anything else we should talk about on today's show before we let everyone go?
I think that wraps it up, Jonathan.